On a remote hillside near Mount Ararat in Turkey lies a huge and mysterious boat shape. Many scientists believe it's just an unusual rock formation, but some investigators claim that, amazingly, it's the physical remains of Noah's Ark.
Well, we made it, guys. This is it. We are standing on Noah's Ark. If this was a natural rock formation, it would be a jagged, irregular shape or a jumble of just little rocks and boulders. Instead, you actually see the boundaries of the boat. I had to investigate it.
According to the Bible, it was here in the mountains of Ararat that the Ark landed, with Noah's family and breeding pairs of all the world's animals on board. After surviving a great flood sent by God to destroy the entire world.
Now we are in the middle of the Ark. It fits the biblical size.
What is the truth? Are there other, more convincing geological explanations? Or are these really the remains of Noah's Ark?
Despite what the Bible says, there is actually zero archaeological evidence for Noah, an ark, or a flood.
Sometimes there is no truth, but I am a huge believer that there are usually some grains of truth in most myths and legends.
On a hillside near Mount Ararat in Turkey, this mysterious boat shape is believed by some to be the actual historical remains of Noah's Ark.
The world is fascinated by stories, myths and legends from the Holy Grail to Noah's Ark, and we're forever trying to find proof that these things exist. I think the hunger for the search is the fact that people are searching for God. And so if someone finds the Ark, then it could be proof that God exists.
Over the years, many religious explorers have searched the Middle East, hoping to prove that the story of Noah's voyage on the Ark during God's great flood is the literal truth.
It's been a big thing among adventurers for centuries. In fact, Marco Polo, way back, said the Ark is on Mount Ararat, but he said, unfortunately, the mountain is too snowy to climb.
During the 1970s and 80s, astronaut James Irwin, who had become a born-again Christian after returning from the moon, made many expeditions up Mount Ararat in search of the Ark, but failed to find any evidence of it. Today, the unusual boat shape discovered over 30 kilometers south of Mount Ararat may be the best hope of proving that Noah's Ark actually existed, and that, amazingly, its remains have survived to the present day. Today, the leading investigator of the site is devout Christian Andrew Jones. Accompanied by research teams, he's been visiting and studying the site for more than 20 years.
Yeah, I first came here in 1997, and I was in college, and it was like a dream come true. It was the most exciting trip, because you're thinking you're walking on the remains of Noah's Ark. Now, I've been here about 16 or 17 times since 1997. There's always something new that happens on each trip. And now, of course, this trip, we're focused on radaring the site and getting survey work done above ground. And so that's exciting. We're just really wanting to see what's below the ground. And so that's why we are here today.
Armed with the latest scientific equipment, Andrew Jones's mission on this trip is to finally gather enough evidence to convince skeptics that the boat shape near Mount Ararat is more than just an unusual rock formation. He's hoping to prove it really is Noah's Ark.
So all of Ararat's in Turkey. It's a 16 or 17,000 foot volcano, the stratovolcano, and it has a year-round glacier on top, so you see the snow up there. And we're working across the valley from Mount Ararat at the Drupanar site.
Back in the 1980s, the Jerupanar site was declared a national protected area by the Turkish government. And as a result, today, Andrew Jones and his team are able to drive right up to the once difficult-to-access site.
In fact, we have just arrived at the visitor center. Now, the Turkish government built this building in 1987 when they dedicated a national park here for the tourists. So we have arrived.
Thank you.
Good morning, Zafir.
Beautiful day, huh?
Yes, it is.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Once their equipment is unloaded, Andrew's investigation team heads straight out to the site to begin work. He's hoping that their latest state-of-the-art scientific equipment, including ground-penetrating radar, will enable them to convince even the most die-hard skeptics that Noah's Ark really has been discovered.
Christian archaeology is a weapon of faith in the arsenal of proving to this modern scientific world that the stories in the Bible are real, and the Ark has become a totemic part of that.
Well, we made it, guys. This is it. We are standing on Noah's Ark. Can you believe it? We got a busy day ahead of us.
If it is a boat, if it is an ark, we're hoping to see basically striations that would correlate to what would be the beams and the ribs of a boat. That would be one major indicator.
To skeptics, however, the site has clearly been shaped by natural geological processes.
When we look at a site like Durapina, and you look at the geology and the geologic history of the area, we know that there was glacial movement there, making it very possible a large rock fell off the side of a mountain, and it got surrounded by rocks that are different hardnesses. In this case, it just happens to be sort of the outline of what we think of as a boat shape.
To me, if it is Noah's Ark, then that's a big plus for proving that, that the Bible is true. If we start digging and find just natural layers of rock and dirt down there, it would be very disappointing. I've looked at this and studied it and investigated it for half my life.
Can Andrew and his research team find sufficient scientific evidence to convince skeptics that the site is the last resting place of Noah's Ark and isn't just an unusual rock formation? Detailed analysis and precise measurement of the boat shape will provide important clues. According to the Bible, after God killed the sinful by flooding the entire world, Noah's family, plus breeding pairs of all the world's animals, landed safely in the Ark in the mountains of Ararat before they began to repopulate the planet. And so if Andrew is correct in his beliefs that the boat shape is indeed the remains of Noah's Ark, then he's walking on the spot where a new world was created.
Noah was the ultimate climate change hero. According to the Bible, he was chosen of God to survive a great cataclysm which would be visited upon the whole earth by God in one of his tantrums. Because the whole earth, apart from Noah and his family, were sinful and needed to be taught a lesson.
Noah is one of the great figures of Genesis. He is the righteous man. He is the man who was chosen out of everybody else because of his piety and his beliefs and his upstanding nature to save the world.
If he really did what he did, and he saved mankind, and, for want of a better word, animal kind as well, then you can't get any guy on the planet that's done more for us than Noah. So, hail Noah.
Andrew Jones is convinced that this remarkable story isn't just a biblical legend. He believes it's factually accurate.
According to the Bible, he was a great man of faith because God said he's going to destroy the world with water, the whole world, and Noah had to believe that. There was no evidence that this would happen, but God said, build a boat. And so I can just imagine him being made fun of and ridiculed for building this giant boat on land. But, ultimately, by obeying God, he was saved. And at the end of the story, the Bible says that the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. And so where is this boat? And so that's what we're here looking for.
Most scientists believe this unusual boat shape is simply a rock formation shaped by an ancient landslide. But Andrew is hoping his research team can gather enough scientific evidence to convince skeptics that it really is Noah's Ark.
How you doing, Seth?
Just finished 120 scans.
You finished 120 scans?
Yes, millions
Wow.
of data.
And those points basically creates a 3D model of the object you're shooting.
Exactly. We put them all together, stitch them all together, and it also takes pictures while it's doing it, so it colorizes it, so it looks realistic.
That's amazing. I can't wait to see the results of this.
After fully surveying the site with the high-resolution mapping scanner, the team is soon able to build a preliminary 3D picture of the parts of the boat-shaped formation that are visible above ground.
So the results we've gotten, we're extremely pleased with. Right now, this is bird's eye view, and you can see this is kind of the bow of what we believe to be a ship structure. And this is the backside of it. And then this is the limestone structure that they believe this boat got impaled on as it came down the mudslide. And then you can kind of see the surrounding topography. You almost can kind of visually see the mudslide coming down the hill here. With these ravines and cracks, you can kind of see a little bit of the motion and how some of that is kind of parting and going around the structure. We can't make the determination whether it's Noah's Ark or not. What we can do is provide archaeologists the details they need to plan and then be able to do that invasive excavation, try to see what's actually under there.
As excavation of the site is not yet officially approved, over the coming days the team plan to build up a picture of the site below ground using ground-penetrating radar. But their 3D mapping of the site above ground has already helped highlight one very significant fact. Intriguingly, the boat shape very closely matches the dimensions of Noah's Ark, as described in the Bible.
Here we are walking down the starboard side of the ark. And over here is the middle of the structure, and you can see how massive the ark would have been. And it fits the biblical size.
According to the Bible, Noah's Ark was 30 cubits high, 50 cubits wide, and 300 cubits long. In modern terms, roughly 15 meters high, 26 meters wide, and 155 meters long, which is vast. In modern times, the largest wooden ship ever built was the early 20th century American schooner, the Wyoming. A Noah's Ark, supposedly built thousands of years earlier, would have been even bigger.
I think the idea that you could have fitted two of every animal, from the tiniest insects through to giraffes and elephants, onto a single ship, and given the technology of that time, we're really stretching the imagination to breaking point here.
Many scholars have looked into the feasibility of whether Noah or someone like him could have built an ark of this size and scope to do what it was supposed to have done. And the answer always comes back to a resounding no. It's not possible.
In modern times, however, a complete full-size replica of Noah's Ark has been constructed. The Ark Encounter is a Christian theme park, opened in Kentucky in 2016.
To build something like Noah's Ark would have had to happen on basically a military scale. You need organization, structure, hierarchy, logistics, planning. So Noah would have had to have been in charge of all of that. The modern replica in Kentucky required over 3,300,000 board foot of timber. Over 1,000 craftsmen were employed, and it is the largest timber frame structure in the United States. These people built the Ark using modern tools, electricity, gasoline, vehicles. For Noah to do all that with Bronze Age tools would basically mean he was like kind of a Superman. And then, on top of that, he has to become a sea captain of the largest vessel ever built and a zookeeper. Think of all that coming together, and it just boggles the mind.
Andrew Jones, however, believes Noah and his family could have built the Ark, and remains convinced that the boat-shaped formation his team is investigating is the physical remains of Noah's Ark.
If this was a natural rock formation, you would not get this shape of a hull. It would be a jagged, irregular shape, or a jumble of just little rocks and boulders in a mud flow. Instead, you actually see this man-made object, the boundaries of the boat.
Hoping to discover features of Noah's Ark that may be buried underground, Andrew and his team continue surveying the site using ground-penetrating radar. Can they prove that this is the last resting place of Noah's Ark? Or will geological evidence point to more plausible natural explanations for the site's unusual characteristics? As Andrew surveys the site, he becomes more and more convinced in his beliefs that this mysterious boat shape is indeed the physical remains of Noah's Ark, and not an unusually shaped rock formation, as believed by the science.
So we're standing on the pointed uphill end of the Ark. What's really interesting about this boat formation is that the pointed end is uphill. Now you might be wondering, why does that matter? Well, some critics believe that this site was formed naturally, and in that case, they say that there was a rock and a mud flow, and this mud went around this rock and formed the boat shape. Now, the problem with that theory is that this is the complete opposite. If that did happen, the rounded end would be uphill. In this case, the pointed end is uphill. And so we believe that this formation is actually because of the boat, because of Noah's Ark, and not because of any natural processes.
One prominent geologist who's taken an interest in the Darupanar site, and who strongly challenges Andrew Jones's interpretation of it, is David Montgomery, Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Washington.
I'm the kind of geologist that's known as a geomorphologist. That's somebody who studies the evolution of topography, how Earth's surface features are formed. Well, there's a report done by Turkish geologists that have examined that outcrop and concluded that the form is actually a piece of limestone that has been rafted down the mountain on what's known as an earth flow, which is a major landslide, kind of like a glacier made out of mud, if you will. It's a piece of Miocene limestone, 10, 20 million years old, fossiliferous, so there's fossils in it. And it's a hard stretch to think that you would make an ark out of rocks.
As a Christian creationist who believes that the Bible is the literal truth, Andrew Jones has many disagreements with mainstream geology. According to geologists, the Earth is nearly 5 billion years old. But according to creationists, the Earth was created by God in just 7 days, around 4000 BC.
So if you're going to take the Bible at just what it says, then the Earth itself would be around 6,000 years old. The boat would have been a lot, 1,500 years after that. So you're looking at a 4,500, 5,000-year-old object. And so that would be like the conservative creationism point of view on how old this is. Now, we haven't tested it. We haven't done excavations. And I believe in the Bible account, so I believe, it would match. But obviously, no excavation has been done yet at the sea.
Andrew's beliefs about Noah's Ark and the creation rely on the assumption that the world's sedimentary rocks, among which the Ark now supposedly rests, were laid down just a few thousand years ago during the Great Flood.
I respect the Christian faith, but the creationist narrative just does not match up to the science as we know it. It just takes something like looking at the cliffs of Dover and realizing that every piece of chalk there is the skeleton of a once tiny microorganism that slowly built up over millions of years. And when you look at something that's 500 foot tall and you realize that deposited at maybe 1 millimeter a year, you start to realize the scale of what we're talking about and how immense the scale of geologic history is.
However, Andrew hopes that his new scientific investigations at the Juripanar site will prove that the creationists' belief in the reality of the Great Flood and Noah's Ark is accurate. Since Andrew's team hasn't received official approval to excavate the site, ground-penetrating radar is the next best option to try to find convincing evidence below ground to help prove that the site isn't a natural rock formation, but really is Noah's Ark.
Is it about, is it not about, is it a natural structure, is it not a natural structure? We're all hoping it's not a natural structure, but we gotta get the data back and get it processed.
The preliminary results of the ground-penetrating radar survey will be ready in the next few days. If the survey does indicate boat-shaped features below ground, that will be a major step forward for Andrew Jones and his team. But until any subsequent excavation is able to prove what's underground, skeptics will still point to other perceived flaws in the belief that the story of Noah's Ark could possibly be true. The most famous part of the story, of course, is that the Ark carried breeding pairs of all the world's animals.
The logistics of running the zoo on Noah's Ark is impossible. I can't even imagine trying to do it. A lot of these animals are carnivores too. They need to eat meat. Others are herbivores, such as cattle, that go through hundreds and hundreds of pounds of food a day. Just the job of removing feces alone would take everybody, all hands on deck, almost all day.
Do you really believe that all those animals went peacefully into that ark without the lions having a go at the monkeys or the tigers killing the zebras? Oh, come on.
Andrew Jones does believe it, but he recognizes that Noah's voyage in the Ark with all the animals would have been a major ordeal.
You can only imagine being Noah with these animals for the whole duration of the flood. And I kind of picture Noah wanting that door open right away. You know, the Bible says it was one door. And so as soon as he opened that door, I bet you everybody, including the animals, just ran off the ark. There's a freedom. So I can picture that happening right here.
But skeptics question whether there is any scientific evidence at all that there ever was a global flood. But in an effort to find corroborating evidence to support his belief that the world did indeed suffer from such a global flood, with Noah's Ark as its sole survivor, Andrew and his local Turkish assistant, Zafer Onay, are now going to visit another site. Just a short trip away are a group of mysterious ancient stones in a nearby village. Andrew hopes they'll provide another promising clue that Noah's Ark did land in this region after the Great Flood. Andrew believes that these stones once had a very practical purpose on board the Ark itself.
Yeah, the big anchor stone is still there.
That's amazing after all these years.
Remarkably, Andrew believes the group of heavy stones found here, known as drogue stones, were once hung over the side of Noah's Ark to stabilize it as it navigated the choppy waters of the Great Flood, sent by God to destroy the entire sinful world.
I think so far they've found like 20-something, 26 or so of these. You'll notice that these drogue stones have holes in them, and so all the drogue stones would have been tied to the Ark. And this is one of the largest stones. In fact, a third of it is below the ground still.
A drugstone is a large standing stone, a megalith with a hole in the top center. They appear to have been used as storm stones, anchors for ships who are going through turbulent waters. Now, we find these around the Mediterranean. We have found them in the Nile River. The question is, what are they doing in the range of Mount Ararat in this part of southeastern Turkey, which is arid? There's no rivers, there's no bodies of water, giving credence to the fact that they could have been used on Noah's Ark, traveling across what is now southeastern Turkey.
But as almost all these stones have lots of Christian crosses carved on them, skeptics point to a more mundane explanation. They are simply Christian tombstones. Yet believers in Noah's Ark have another explanation.
Some scientists, they say, okay, well, if it's anchor stone, what the crosses are doing on it. And what I believe personally, and what I heard from the peoples who believe these are anchor stones, drug stones, which is, they say this is carved later on by Christians, that they still, at the time, they believe this is something from Noah's Ark.
Were these stones really used to stabilize Noah's Ark during God's great flood? And then later reused as gravestones by local Christians, who revered their connection to the Ark? Skeptics refute the suggestion. One reason is because geologists say there is no evidence for a global flood at any time in history, indicating that the story of Noah's Ark cannot be true.
You really have to throw away the last couple centuries of geology and all the science and physics and chemistry and biology and paleontology that goes along with that to embrace the idea that the world was shaped by Noah's flood.
There's no evidence anywhere in the world of a massive worldwide flood at any time. There's no other, apart from myths, there's no other written record, and you certainly can't call the Bible a historical record.
Geologic history has a much longer and more complicated story told in the sediments of the rocks themselves than could be recorded in a single global flood. So if there never was a global flood, are there geologically plausible explanations for the story of Noah's flood? A very reasonable explanation behind flood stories can be the idea of a regional flood that essentially took out the land that people considered to be the world, their home.
I mean, to flood the entire planet up to the summits of Mount Everest, say, would require 4 times the amount of water that's in the oceans today. So it just does not seem feasible, let alone it's then supposed to disappear suddenly. So what's more likely is that there was some kind of catastrophic flooding in the region, you know, maybe some sort of movement in the Mediterranean or the Black Sea. And this was remembered as a folk memory. Maybe it was a story that was told round the firesides, and it changed and it morphed, and it became different myths in different civilizations.
Geological evidence shows that one area of the world which suffered occasional, massive and catastrophic regional floods in antiquity was the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, where civilization began over 5,000 years ago.
There is evidence within the Mesopotamian region of the flood of the Tigris River dating to about 2900 BCE. So this we can date by pottery shards that are found just before and just after this level, this geological level, that gives us quite a firm date for that.
At the time, around 5,000 years ago, local people affected by this huge, devastating flood in Mesopotamia could easily have believed that the whole world was flooded.
If you're looking at a worldwide deluge, when you consider what world means to a person who only has ever been within a couple miles, 10 miles, maybe even 100 miles of the place that they were born, that's a lot different than our global concept of the world today.
The Bible story of Noah's Ark surviving a global flood was written a couple of thousand years after the Great Flood in Mesopotamia. But could the biblical account have been inspired by it? Andrew Jones continues his work to prove that he has found Noah's Ark. His research team has almost finished their ground-penetrating radar survey, which they hope will identify more boat-like features of the Ark buried underground. While waiting for the results, Andrew is heading to visit a nearby site where the graves of Noah and his wife are said to have been discovered a few decades ago, in the hope of finding further evidence to support his theory.
Whatever Noah was, and I'm talking about what the Bible actually says, he wasn't a human being in any sense that we understand. For a start, he was 650 years old, but also he, according to some accounts, was a mere 12 feet tall, possibly even taller than that.
Andrew Jones hopes any evidence remaining at Noah's gravesite will support the idea that he was a giant. If this part of the story of Noah in the Bible is true, then it implies that the rest of the story may also be true, and that Noah's Ark did land near here.
And so the two big headstones were right here. One was fallen over, and then one was standing up. Everything disappeared. The headstones are gone. It's all broken up.
Since its discovery a few decades ago, the site has been ransacked by treasure hunters. As well as the headstones, they're said to have taken away a huge sarcophagus.
Yeah, this 18-foot-long trench was created because in '83, some locals, with the help of, they say, a foreigner, dug up this grave. And it was a 15-foot-long box they pulled out of it, a stone sarcophagus. And so that suggests that whoever was buried in there was a giant, just like we were thinking that says in the Bible.
Skeptics are highly doubtful about this, however.
I think it's important not to equate the size of the tomb with the physical size of a man, because after all, we have tombs of popes that lived in the Renaissance, for example, and they're massive of scale, but the Pope was just a regular-sized man, maybe even shorter than we're used to, so.
To skeptics, Noah and his wife are just legendary figures, not real people who lived around 5,000 years ago. Today, the most credible evidence challenging the factual legitimacy of the Noah's Ark story comes from the remarkable discovery of some ancient clay tablets bearing the world's oldest writing. Dr. Selina Wisnam, an Assyriologist at Queen's College, University of Oxford, is one of only a handful of experts able to read the mysterious writing on the tablets, which come from Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, where civilization began over 5,000 years ago.
It's the earliest writing system we have anywhere in the world, so it gives us our oldest sources of information for all kinds of facets of human life, from the very invention of cities and agriculture, right through to the Babylonian sciences, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, etc.
Over the years, decipherment of a number of Mesopotamian tablets has provided dramatic evidence about the likely origins of the biblical story of the Great Flood and Noah's Ark.
This tablet is a replica of an incredibly important tablet because it was the first one to be discovered that had any trace of a Babylonian flood myth on it. It was discovered in the 19th century by a self-taught scholar, George Smith. He was reading through these, working through it, and then he came across the reference to the universal flood. And this was incredibly exciting at the time.
Dating to around 1800 BC, and now known to be part of the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, this tablet was the first of many Mesopotamian variations of the flood story that have since been found.
In all of the flood myths, the plot is essentially the same. There is a hero. He's usually a good man, a moral man, a man that follows the decrees of God or gods. And he tries to save a bit of the world, save a bit of humanity and a little bit of the animals that were populated on it by putting them into a big boat to escape a great deluge.
The similarities between the original Mesopotamian flood story and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the subsequent story of Noah's Ark, written in the Bible around 1,000 years later, are remarkable.
In both, a god tells a human figure that the flood is going to come, tells him how to get around it, tells him to build a boat. In both versions, the god tells the person to take on board 2 of every kind of life, all of the food that they'll need. In both cases, actually giving the very dimensions of the boat, really detailed instructions about how to construct it.
The boats of the Epic of Gilgamesh's hero, Utnapishtim, and another Mesopotamian flood hero, Artrahasis, are also intriguingly similar in size, if not in shape, to the Bible's description of Noah's Ark.
Utnapishtim's ark was supposed to be a cube. Artrahasis had an ark that was a kufa, or a kind of a coracle, a round boat, which had multiple tiers as well. And then Noah's ark was supposed to be like 3 stories, a long rectangular. We've got very specific size for that. Big door at the end. What's interesting about all of these is that if we take the understanding of the space that was given to create these in the stories, they all tend to be about the same cubic space, if you will, which is really interesting. It seems to suggest that the stories descend one from the other.
There are many other details in the stories that match. For example, birds are sent out 3 times from both the Mesopotamian boat and Noah's Ark in order to search for land.
If we go down to this line here, this is where it describes the sending out of the first bird. Mash Shar. So I let the bird out, setting it free. Ituram Ma. The bird went off, but it returned.
To most experts, the numerous similarities between the Mesopotamian flood story and the biblical story of Noah's Ark, written over 1,000 years later, are much too great to be just coincidental.
Probably the reason why there are these similarities between these stories is that the Israelites were actually in Babylonia during the 6th century BC. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had sacked Jerusalem and then deliberately moved the population around and resettled them closer to the Babylonian capital. So the Israelites would have been coming into contact with these Mesopotamian flood stories.
The idea of a global flood catastrophe where a prophet-like figure leads a select group of people and animals out of the disaster and to a new world is something that recurs in many mythologies, and particularly in Mesopotamia. So you have, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in the Sumerian Babylonian civilizations, this story recurs. And Noah comes up, of course, in the Torah, the Jewish Torah, he's in the Christian Bible, and he's also in the Muslim Quran.
Andrew Jones, however, doesn't accept that the Bible story of Noah's Ark derives from Mesopotamian myth. His research team has now finished their ground-penetrating radar survey. And as a result of what they've found underground, Andrew is more convinced than ever that these are the remains of Noah's Ark. But he has his work cut out to convince the skeptics that these are anything more than unusually shaped rocks.
There is absolutely no evidence of the Ark existing on Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey. None.
I think it is just some form of rock structure that's formed and looks like a boat.
Andrew's investigation team, however, has just finished surveying the Durapanar site with ground-penetrating radar. Taking a first look at the data, there's great excitement that it may show hidden features of Noah's Ark buried underground.
When they get about 8 feet down, 8.5 feet down, we're starting to see some parallel vertical structure. And then as we go down a little bit deeper, we get down to right at about 9 feet, we actually see an intersection of that parallel and a horizontal. So we're actually getting right angles.
Whoa.
Underneath the ground.
Oh, you can see it right there.
Yep.
Yeah.
You got almost like a little cavity where you've got a right angle being created.
It's like 3 or 4 right angles.
Mm-hmm.
So is there no way this could be natural or what?
Typically, you're not going to find straight lines and right angles in a natural environment. That's man-made items, yeah.
It will take considerable time for the raw data to be fully processed. So for now, the team's initial interpretation of the data is all there is to go on.
Well, this is just raw data. It's not processed yet. We can't tell what it is, but typically right angles don't exist in nature. So this kind of leads you to believe that there may be something man-made under there. I think it definitely gives enough to say, hey, let's investigate further. Let's start digging up. Let's see what this is.
Skeptics, however, are concerned that Andrew Jones and his team are simply finding what they're looking for.
There's a phenomenon called pareidoia, and really it means that you kind of see what you want to see. And if you've invested a lot of your personal identity into a faith that has an idea such as the Earth is 6,000 years old, there was a global flood, it makes sense that people who are out looking to prove this are going to start finding evidence that other people aren't seeing, and that doesn't hold up to the science.
Historically, throughout the history of archaeology, throughout the history of history, when people want to find something, they often mistake what they found for the thing they wanted to find.
All in all, skeptics doubt there's any chance that the story of Noah's Ark is the literal truth. The geological evidence from the Darupinar site, along with the similarity of ancient Mesopotamian flood myths, and the logistical challenges of building an ark and populating it with the world's largest zoo, lead skeptics to propose other explanations. Most likely, perhaps, the story of Noah's Ark derives from a catastrophic regional flood in Mesopotamia or elsewhere in the Middle East thousands of years ago, which was vividly remembered in myth and then passed down to biblical times.
One of the important things to remember with all these myths is that no matter how old they are, underlying them, there could be some element of truth. In Genesis, it says that he should take one pair of every animal. Now, that's not even remotely feasible. But that doesn't mean that there may not have been some story that went down in myth that people remembered about some person or group of people saving some local animals from a particularly disastrous flood.
And I suppose that some guy living on a farm in the remote part of wherever it happened to be at the time, Mesopotamia, could have been a huge flood to him and his neighbours. They probably never ventured more than 20 miles away in the whole of their lifetime. So that was the world to them.
Andrew Jones, however, continues to search for proof that the biblical story of Noah's Ark is the literal truth. He remains hopeful that if he can get permission to excavate the Darupinar site in the years to come, he'll be able to find sufficient proof to convince even the most staunch skeptics that this unusual boat shape really is Noah's Ark.
Ultimately, we hope to find a ship buried below the ground. This would include rooms, floors that would match the biblical account. The Bible talks about having 3 decks and rooms for the animals. And so that's what we hope to find below the ground there.
Whatever the truth may ultimately be, Andrew Jones' quest to find definitive proof for the existence of Noah's Ark, the smoking gun that could prove the Bible is literally true, will undoubtedly long continue. At the end of World War II, Allied soldiers uncovered vast hordes of stolen goods across Europe. Under Hitler's command, the Nazis had systematically plundered museums and private collections for priceless treasures and works of art.
The scale at which the Nazis looted and stockpiled the greatest masterworks of European art, it's truly staggering.
There's works by Picasso, works by Klimt, works by Caravaggio. There's many works of art that have simply disappeared.
While ravaging Europe of its cultural heritage, rumour has it that Hitler was also on the quest for an even bigger prize: holy relics. Especially the Holy Grail and the power that having these objects would bring.
So on the one level, these objects are historical artifacts of artistic and cultural merit, but one can't get away from the fact that the occultism of Nazism also imbued them with special powers.
He believed that there was a coded treasure map built into the painting that would have led to some of the most venerated Christian relics.
Hitler was organizing a different type of power. He was organizing the power of religious persuasion.
On January the 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany. Over the coming months, he grew in power and became a dictator. He saw himself as king of the world.
What Nazism was trying to achieve was basically creating a political religion. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. No one has really created a political religion before this point in quite the same way.
If you look at Nazism, if you look at all of its elements holistically, you can't but come to the conclusion that there's something very religious about it. And by that I mean it had beliefs, it had a central figure, it had an idea for how you would reach salvation, it had a mission, it had dogma, it had imagery. You only have to think of the cathedrals of light at Nuremberg built by Speer, of the hypnotic chanting and marching, of the adulation towards this one Christ-like figure, which is how Hitler monstrously liked to present himself. So it should be seen as an ideology, but with absolute cult wrapping around it.
What he strove to do was to replace organized religion in Germany with a new Nazi religion, that Jesus would be an Aryan, that instead of the Bible there would be Mein Kampf, and that instead of the crucifix there would be the swastika.
This would have been a horrifying church. It's a church that believed in racial purity, a church that was part of a socialist government that believed that anybody that wasn't of the purest form was not worthy of living or would have been subjected below the Aryans. Also, they were pulling and hijacking elements of pagan religion, occult religion, and throw in just the Nazi brutality. Imagine going to that church.
German expansion throughout Europe began in 1938 with the annexation of Austria and then continued with the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. At the same time, Hitler's number two, Heinrich Himmler, was expanding his knowledge of the occult. He was convinced the Nazis could achieve great victories by harnessing the powers of the relics.
Several of the other Nazis in the hierarchy did lean towards the occult, but mainly, of course, it was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who had this glorified idea of how the chivalric ideal of the medieval times could somehow be channeled through him and his henchmen, but he was completely bonkers.
The Nazis were systematically looting Europe of all of the ancient holy relics that they could. But if you think about it from his perspective, Churches in Europe at this time period had a lot of power and persuasion over the local population. By taking the most sacred things, you're taking the power and the influence and essentially kind of ripping the heart out of it. He wanted the churches to be dictated by him. The new religion, the new empire, Hitler's religion.
Hitler had an idea for after the war. He was going to have this sort of palatial museum, which would be the best and biggest museum in the world, and would have the best art in it. So he basically sent his stormtroopers out to bring that art back to Germany.
Noah Charney is an art crimes investigator and has been studying the Nazis' obsession with artworks and relics.
To understand the Nazi interest in holy relics, it's important to know the place of origin of Nazism. And it really grew up in a socioeconomic world in middle-class Germany and Austria, where people were focused on mysticism and the supernatural. This belief in the occult was really in the cultural oxygen of the time, so it sounds maybe funny to us today, but at the time it was not very exotic. And the Nazi Party actually began as an occult fraternity before it morphed into a political party. Hitler and Himmler had this concept of creating a sort of new religion. And one of the things that fascinated them was the legend of Parzival, which was a medieval Christian poem that had been popularized in the late 19th century, and also through Wagner's interpretation of the Grail myth.
The Arma Christi, or weapons of Christ, were the implements that were used in Christ's Passion. They consist of the crown of thorns, the holy nails, the Veronica veil, and pieces of the true cross. These objects were venerated by Catholics, but also thought by some to have supernatural powers. And certain key Nazis, Himmler and Hitler above all, really believed that they did. But chief among the objects the Nazis wanted to find was the Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail is incredibly significant for all sorts of reasons for different people. For devout Christians, it's the cup that caught the blood of Christ as he hung on the cross just after the spear of destiny pierced his side. It is for other Christians the vessel that he drank out of at the Last Supper. It is for people in search of global domination, a vessel that is meant to provide that power.
If anybody wanted the Holy Grail, it was Adolf Hitler. It was the thing that was going to give them absolute invincibility and great knowledge and the meaning of life and everything else they would want. It was the Holy Grail.
As the story goes, Hitler thought he could locate the Holy Grail if he could get his hands on the Ghent altarpiece. Within it, he believed was a secret code that would lead him to the relic. The 12 panels of Jan van Eyck's famous Adoration of the Mystic Lamb is believed to be the most influential painting in history, and perhaps the greatest artwork that the Nazis stole.
Everything bad that could possibly happen to a work of art has happened to this one. It's been stolen at least 6 times, all or in part. It's been the object of forgery, it was nearly destroyed, parts of it were burned, it was dismembered, pillaged, used for ransom. The final and most dynamic adventure of the Ghent altarpiece led it here to this salt mine deep in the Austrian Alps that was converted by the Nazis into this high-tech stolen art warehouse.
The Altersee salt mines in Austria were one of the many underground storage facilities used by the Nazis. It's believed that in this location alone, over 7,000 pieces of art were hidden. Noah meets with Harold Pernkopf, a local expert, to get a better understanding of how the Nazis used this underground treasure vault.
So now we're going to walk about 700 meters inside the mine. That's where the art was hidden.
Tell me a little bit about why this was such an ideal atmosphere to store art.
Yeah, in here we have 70% of humidity, 7 degrees of Celsius, and the air is very salty, so this make perfect conditions, except for iron. So iron gets rusty in here, but all kind of paintings or even paper we think 70 or 75% of humidity would be too wet, but the salt preserves perfectly.
And I imagine there were no concerns about bombs because we're very well secured inside this mountain.
Yes, we are 700 meters inside the mine, and we have 200 meters of solid rock above us.
People watching this program will think, well, what a ridiculous place to put valuable works of art in a salt mine, dripping with water, damp, awful conditions. But basically, you go into the salt mine where these works of art were stored, and you've got perfect conditions. It's perfectly dry. The conditions are for some reason, better than basements or anywhere else. And when you actually look at the wood, it's as if I'd sort of knocked the nails in last week and created these frames. It was perfect, and that's why they stored all their works of art there.
So about how many pieces of art were stored here?
Over 7,000 paintings, but also gold coin collections, weapon collections, Michelangelo's Madonna from Bruges. There were 8 different rooms, big rooms, 40,000 square meters of storage room. All were connected with railroad tracks. That's why they didn't have to carry them for... It's hard to say how many things were in here, and it's more hard to say the value of the whole collection.
Sure.
When they set out to see what they could find, they were shocked at the hordes of fine art, of gold, of silver, of stash of the Nazis of one kind or another. And they were quite horrified because it gave them an inkling as to the magnitude of what had just gone on. They had no idea it was a huge movement, and most of the museums of Europe had been depleted.
When the Althusser treasure trove was discovered at the end of the war, the Ghent altarpiece was among the priceless works of art hidden in these rooms.
He also wanted it because it was considered the single most important painting ever made, and so it was to be the centerpiece of his planned super museum at Linz. But there are also some alternative theories about why he may have wanted it. One of them goes that he believed that there was a coded treasure map built into the painting that would have led to some of the most venerated Christian relics, and that he might have wanted these for both symbolic and perhaps supernatural reasons.
The occult was incredibly important to the Nazis, but not for the straightforward reasons one might think. Yes, Himmler clearly believed in this mumbo-jumbo, but the reality is that the efficacy of it was not in performing rituals that did anything. It was in cloaking the entire Nazi project in a certain magical legitimacy that leaped way back into the deepest mythical history that the German people really needed to boost their morale and to feel good about themselves.
This was just one of many locations where the Nazis hid their stolen loot. All across Europe, secret layers can be found where they stashed priceless valuables and, more importantly to the regime, holy relics. But even today, nearly 80 years on, some artworks remain missing.
The reality is there are thousands upon thousands of masterworks still lost. Not clear whether the Nazis hid them so carefully we've yet to find them, or whether they destroyed them if they perhaps were particularly repugnant in terms of their religious iconography.
Poland was invaded by the Nazis in 1939, and it became an important part of the Reich's strategy for taking over Europe. Like France and Italy, its artwork and holy relics were ruthlessly stolen by the Nazis. Polish journalist and explorer Johanna Lamparska has spent several years investigating the Nazis' theft of art and holy treasures. It's generally accepted that the Nazis hid this loot all over occupied Europe, It was a vast collection of material.
They moved all very valuable items to Germany first, to Berlin, to museums, to private collection of Himmler, Hitler, and so on. But when allies were approaching from the west and when Russian army started to approach from the east, they chose a few castles and palaces and abbey in Lower Silesia to collect all these church and museum items, valuable things, just to protect them from other armies.
One of the locations that was used to store their plunder was Lubiaz Abbey in southwest Poland. It's a former monastery and architecturally one of the largest Christian complexes in the world. Its underground spaces were used extensively by the Nazis to build research laboratories and manufacturing plants. Johanna has come to Lubiaz to search its subterranean tunnels and chambers with a team of experienced local treasure hunters. Can they find evidence of the priceless holy relics and other valuables allegedly hidden at the site?
They had to find hidden places, and in the end of war, they brought it here. Explorers and treasure hunters believe that something still may be hidden in this abbey.
Amongst this labyrinth of tunnels and passageways, secret rooms and spaces lay hidden behind brick and stone walls. The team is using high-tech methods to explore these dark voids.
Krzysztof is using so-called inspection endoscope camera. It is a very small camera, stick to a wire or a cable or a stick, and you put it into a very narrow hole to see what is on the other side of the wall. In this abbey, the Germans made a military factory during the war, and they robbed the whole monastery and they hid all valuables from these buildings somewhere. As far as we know, they were buried in a crypt for a moment, then they were stolen. But there is a lot of treasure hunters who still believe that something could be hidden in a locked chambers in the cellars of this abbey.
Some people are looking for golds, some people are looking for works of arts. Nobody knows what is hidden here.
Churches under the shadow of the Nazi regime saw their prized relics and masterpieces spirited away. But this was more than mere robbery. Hitler and many in his regime positively loathed the Christian religion.
The reason why Hitler had such a loathing for Catholicism was that fundamentally the idea behind Catholicism and Christianity is that everybody is equal in God's eyes, that everybody shares God's love. To Nazis, that's absolutely anathema. For them, there are complete hierarchies of the order of people, so they had to exterminate those values that they didn't believe in. So a war was begun against Catholicism.
The Nazis are arresting priests, they're closing down Roman Catholic organizations, they're shutting down Catholic political parties, and so there's just this growing stress and tension between Catholicism and Nazism.
Hitler took a very firm line with the Polish people. He knew the majority were practicing Christians, regular and faithful churchgoers, but wanted them to follow and believe in a new Nazi ideology.
Catholic Church was very strong link to Polish national history, and it was very important for Germans to close the churches, to destroy them, to turn them into prison, just to humiliate Christian community in Poland.
They took over thousands of Polish churches. Many of those priests were sent to either concentration camps or killed. Most of the relics and artifacts were taken and essentially just wiped the Polish church culture from existence.
One of the most bizarre examples of Nazi cultural vandalism can be found here in St. Michael's Church, located in the town of Olesno in present-day Poland. A member of the local clergy leads Johanna to the site of this extraordinary crime.
During World War II, Nazis come here and take down the biggest and most beautiful bell of this St. Michael Church. It was taken to Germany and was lost until the end of the war.
Because the Nazis never wasted anything. They took the metal and they melted it down and they used it for munitions. So they'd taken these bells from buildings of peace and turned them into weapons.
So terrified were priests at the prospect of their holy relics, the chalices and the monstrances and the bells being stolen by the Nazis, that they even put them into coffins and staged fake funerals in order to hide these items from prying Nazi eyes.
Fortunately for the parishioners of Olesno, the mystery of their church bells had a happy conclusion.
For 60 years, Christian community on Lesno was wondering where their bell could be. They heard something about Bell Cemetery in Hamburg. They heard that somebody recovered their bells in other cities. So they decided to look for information. And when they were informed that there is a church in Germany with a bell from Lesno, they decided to act and they recover this piece of art.
But not all religious objects stolen from churches were put to such practical uses. For the Nazis, some holy relics served much more occult purposes. The Nazis' grand plan was to capture and then display some of the greatest holy relics in the world. In the end, they only captured one piece, the Holy Lance, which was claimed to be the actual spear that pierced Christ's side while he was on the crucifix.
The Spear of Destiny, or Lance of Longinus, was something that Hitler felt had deep symbolic significance for him. When he first saw it in the museum in Vienna, he said he felt as if he'd formerly held it, that it was his talisman of power, and it gave the destiny of the world to him in his hands.
Despite the Nazis having taken it to Nuremberg, today this legendary object is kept with the other priceless artifacts in the treasury of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Dr. Franz Kirschweger is the collection's curator.
In the glass case that we have upstairs in the treasury, we see the Holy Lance together with the big piece, which was supposed to come from the Holy Cross of Jesus Christ. And it's together with this immense, huge jeweled cross, actually, which was made to house these two most precious relics. It's definitely very important to know that the Holy Lance is part of a big group of objects, of insignia and relics that were brought together over many centuries.
This extraordinary assortment of objects is part of the imperial regalia, the ceremonial crown jewels of the Holy Roman Emperors. Dating back to medieval times, the most important parts were the imperial crown, imperial sword, and the Christ-linked Spear of Destiny.
This spear that supposedly pierced the side of Christ and thus was empowered with his power then went on to develop even greater legend as it passed from the hand of one powerful man to the other, under the belief that if they wielded this spear, they were omnipotent and they could bend the world to their will.
For Hitler, having the imperial regalia of the Holy Roman Empire was his aspiration to create a 1,000-year Reich. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire had lasted 1,000 years, so he wanted his Reich to last the same amount of time. And in the same way that Holy Roman emperors had sacred relics which gave them authority before the people, Hitler viewed these sacred relics, such as the Spear of Destiny, in the same light.
Hitler got his hands on a Spear of Destiny. Now, the fact is that several different objects have been presented as the Spear of Destiny, which again goes to show you that the importance of this object isn't really in the thing itself, it's in what it stood for.
As far as the lens is concerned, the spear is concerned, we definitely know that the way it looks like is from a different age than from Christ, Jesus Christ. It comes from the Carolingian time, that means late 8th century, and it's probably linked to the person and the history of Charlemagne.
The whole story of the Spear of Longinus and the way it's treated by these sort of junk historians, it's like the Ark of the Covenant in episode 1 of Indiana Jones. It's going to give them, the Nazis, infinite power. It's just total nonsense. It's just another relic that's meant to be associated with Christ, and you know and I know that that's just simply not true.
We are still in a process among scholars to find out whether there is a chance that small parts maybe of a former Holy Lance or of a former Holy Nail was integrated, was forced into the lance. So there are options that we can say for sure, no, that's definitely not true, or we can say it's definitely true. So there is still a way of, even for the ones who want to believe, to do so.
For centuries, Nuremberg had been home to the imperial regalia, and Hitler thought that the city was where they belonged. But in the late 1700s, these crown jewels were hastily moved from Nuremberg to Vienna to avoid Napoleon's clutches, and Hitler was determined to take them back. In 1938, the lance, as well as the rest of the imperial regalia, was brought back to its former home of Nuremberg.
Nuremberg was sacred to the Nazis. It was the traditional heart of the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire had been, at its heart, a German state. And so Hitler wanted to return these items of power to this heart and rule his Third Reich from it.
Nuremberg was the heart of Nazism. It's where Hitler held all the early rallies. It's where they would reconvene every year to extol the virtues of Nazism. But it was also a deeply symbolic place. It was one of the great medieval cities of southern Germany. It was a place where the church and relics and cathedrals had very powerful sway. It was a symbolic place in the German mind. And the Nazis harnessed all of that and made it their cult headquarters.
Today, Nuremberg has moved on from its troubled past. But the crumbling and decaying remains of the Nazi Party rally grounds still evoke memories of the barbaric regime that constructed them. A regime for whom awe and spectacle was key to its survival.
It's an amazing feeling to be here for the very first time at the Nazi rally grounds in Nuremberg. If you can imagine tens of thousands of people gathered here during 6 enormous rallies between 1933 and 1938. This is the Zeppelin field, and over here on this grandstand is where Hitler would have given his most famous speeches.
But as Hitler stood on the podium at Nuremberg, promising an empire to last 1,000 years, he also looked to the past to help secure it.
There are a couple of ideas about why Hitler wanted to possess the crown jewels so badly, particularly the Spear of Destiny. The more accepted theory is its symbolic value. that it would symbolically link him to all of the past Germanic kings, the Holy Roman emperors, and he saw himself as the latter-day version of them, a new incarnation for the Third Reich. But then there are the more exotic theories that may posit, and it's entirely plausible that Hitler would have believed this, that some of these holy relics, particularly the Spear of Destiny, might have granted the owner some sort of superhuman powers. In fact, the legend goes that the Spear of Destiny, if it's carried in battle, whoever carries it can't lose. And we know that Hitler and Himmler were researching things that would support the war effort for supernatural means as well. So it's entirely plausible to believe that Hitler thought, hedging his bets, that possession of the Spear of Destiny might have helped from a military standpoint as well.
The Holy Lance, or Spear of Destiny, was initially kept in Nuremberg together with other priceless pieces, which comprised the imperial regalia, or German crown jewels. But as the tide of war turned against the Nazis, thoughts soon turned to hiding their precious relics. Noah follows the trail, which takes him into the heart of the city.
When the Second World War was brought to Germany and the Allies started bombing, there was a serious concern that some of the art treasures of Nuremberg, including the crown jewels, would be destroyed in an Allied air raid. In order to prevent this, it was ordered that the crown jewels should be stored in a secret bunker, a vault underneath Nuremberg Castle where I'm standing now. That vault is where the crown jewels remained throughout the war until they disappeared from this locked vault.
Today, this tunnel system is known as the Kunstbunker. Noah meets guide Andreas Clements, who can tell him more about the intriguing site where the imperial regalia and the Holy Lance were safely hidden from the Allies.
The bunker originally was a beer cellar. The beer cellars are now 640 years old. There are 4 football fields of them, and in some spots they're up to 4 floors deep. This place was bomb-proof. The spot where we're standing right now has approximately 24 meters of solid sandstone rock on top, so that was safe from bombs. Next thing they did, they put in a ventilation system. So fire was no problem here, bombs were no problem here. The place was dry, the place was well ventilated. So at least during wartime, this was perfect to store artwork.
Even as the Allies overran Germany, the treasure stored in the Kunstbunker should have remained hidden. But a US Army intelligence officer named Walter Horn had a lucky break. Yet Horn wasn't an average intelligence officer. He had an extensive education in art history.
Walter Horn was a senior intelligence officer in the US Army, and at the end of the war, he was interrogating a 48-year-old German private, a rather beleaguered figure called Fritz Huber. And he was asking him about biological, chemical weapons that the Americans were worried that Hitler may have concealed in certain ways that could be used at the end of the war. They weren't getting anywhere in the interrogation. And then Huber just asked him whether he was interested in old art. And not realizing maybe that Horn was a professor of history, a medievalist at Harvard. And he then started to describe artifacts which Horn suddenly realized was the imperial regalia, including the Spear of Destiny. And it was buried underneath Nuremberg Castle in an air-conditioned bunker.
The American forces captured Nuremberg in April 1945. And Horn sent a report detailing where they could find the Nazi secret bunker. But before the US soldiers could enter the Aladdin's Cave of Treasures, the imperial regalia were removed by 3 clever Nazi soldiers who were one step ahead.
Towards the end of the war, it became clear that rather sooner than later Nuremberg would be conquered by the Americans. They were coming quite close. The 3 men in charge of the bunker wanted to save the regalia from the, as they put it, cultureless Americans. So they conspired to remove the most important pieces: crown, scepter, orb, and sword.
By July 1945, Germany was defeated, and Horn had transferred from intelligence into the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archive program. This group, better known as the Monuments Men, was established by the US government to track down art and cultural items stolen by the Nazis. And they had been sent to the Nuremberg bunker to track down the imperial regalia detailed in Horn's report.
The Monuments Men find the bunker, they do an inventory, and early on they notice, the 4 most important pieces were missing. And they start looking for them, for those 3 guys. They find 2 of those guys, and they interrogate them for several hours. And at first they keep their mouths shut. And at one point, one of them gives up the location, shows the real regalia to the Americans, supposedly after they promised him the regalia would not be taken to the US, but would be given back to Vienna.
So it's interesting that they chose 4 objects, but they didn't take the Holy Lance.
No, it shows you what was considered important. They chose what they considered important, the symbols of power, not the relics.
Thanks to the efforts of the Monuments Men, lost masterpieces such as the Ghent altarpiece and the imperial regalia of the Holy Roman Emperors were recovered amid the chaos and devastation that followed Germany's eventual defeat. In fact, their colossal undertaking saw a staggering 5 million pieces of art and artifacts recovered and returned to their rightful owners.
The Monuments Men were incredibly successful. I think they were surprised by their own success. We have photographs of them standing by, classic works of art, standing by, gold bullion stacked as tall as they are, jars full of gold teeth that presumably were taken from Holocaust victims. I mean, shockwaves went through the Allies when they realized just the extent of how the Nazis had pillaged everything in Europe.
But the story is far from over. While many looted works surfaced from the Nazis' hidden network of caves and bunkers, a significant number of other pieces are still out there somewhere, either lost or in the wrong hands.
The legacy of the Nazis having spent so much time plundering and looting cultural artifacts, relics, art is still with us. These objects still surface today on the black market, in auction houses, in private collections, and there are still lists of the vast number of them that remain missing.
There are still black markets for antiquities from World War II, stolen goods, and you'd be surprised at just how many illegal auctions and trades are going on in goods from that era. But there are teams of forensic scientists, archaeologists, ex-police officers, and detectives actively hunting down some of these artifacts, relics, and treasures to get them back to the families of the original owners.
Almost 80 years after their theft, individuals and organizations around the world are still on a quest to recover these lost works. In the Polish city of Krakow, there's a collection of restored paintings that reflect the fate of so many of these stolen Nazi treasures. Journalist and explorer Johanna Lamparska visits St. Mary's Basilica to learn the fate of the cycle of St. Catherine of Alexandria from art conservation expert Katarzyna Pakula.
These are Kulmbach paintings.
Yes. Originally, it was 8 panel paintings made by Hans Zies von Kulmbach, who was a painter, Renaissance painter from Nuremberg. And they have been ordered to Krakow in the golden age of Polish culture. It was the beginning of the 16th century.
The 8 paintings that made up this medieval masterpiece were taken by the Nazis during World War II, but even today, not all have been recovered.
Unfortunately, after the war, out of 8 paintings from one altarpiece, 6 paintings came back, so still 2 are missing, and St. Mary's Basilica is searching, and the Polish Ministry of Culture, and hoping that they are still existing.
How does it feel to lose all these beautiful pieces of art?
It is a great loss. It is a great loss, of course, for the church and for the cultural, from the emotional point of view. It is priceless, and they are unique, and they are of the best quality we know of the works of Hans von Kulmbach.
I think it's a huge tragedy that so much of this religious art, iconography and treasure is still missing even today. Now, some of it clearly was simply destroyed, maybe in Allied bombing raids, which is obviously even more tragic in a way. And then you've now today got people trying to find this treasure. You've got people whose entire life's work is to try and maybe find one work of art.
While we do have a sense of certain specific items that we are searching for, and there are people out there all the time trying to recover them, we really don't know the true magnitude of what's missing, and don't even know in some respects what we should be looking for.
Many of these artworks that are considered still missing are actually being actively traded through black market networks, and it's become even easier to do so now with the internet and the deep web. And there are people who fetishize some of these artifacts and trade in them as commodities, and that goes on every day.
There are many existing commissions in Europe and in the United States and Canada to try to repatriate a lot of these pieces as they're found. Some of them eventually wound up in state and local museums and have been relocated to the families from whence they were stolen. But many of them still reside probably in private collections or remain underground, maybe never to be found.
Many people are still obsessed with finding the missing art, including, of course, the people's families who originally owned some of these, because a lot of the art was originally owned by Jewish families who simply had it removed from them.
At least 600,000 of them were stolen from Jewish families, and some 100,000 of them still remain at large.
By the mid-1940s, the tides of World War II had turned, and legend has it that desperate Japanese soldiers buried a treasure of gold and relics in the Philippines.
They took an immense amount of treasure from temples, from banks, anything they could lay their hands on.
It's alleged to have included gold bars, which were taken, melted down as bullion, and re-stamped as Japanese gold.
Is it true that a vast treasure was buried under the Philippines during World War II? And is it still there? Or is it all just a great story?
The idea that there's this vast treasure under the surface, it's just too attractive to resist.
The so-called lost Japanese treasure is one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. While the Nazi looting in Europe took the spotlight, Southeast Asia was also being systematically plundered. A vast collection of relics, antiques, artwork, and importantly gold was amassed over the course of World War II. When things took a turn for the worse for the Japanese forces, they were said to have desperately searched for a location to hide their priceless treasure trove. Is this mythical plunder real? And if so, what was hidden and where? And what, if anything, is left today?
Japan embarked on an absolutely ruthless effort to loot every country that they occupied before and during World War II. We're talking China, Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Philippines. Nothing was safe from their soldiers.
And it's the mere prospect of discovering untold wealth that continues to bring treasure hunters to the Philippines to this day, including Klaus Donner. 4 years ago, the Austrian researcher disappeared off the grid. For a time, no one knew where he was. Then only a few of his closest friends and family were told where he had gone. The Philippines, deep below ground. In the time he's been there, Klaus and his team of local workers have manually dug and pneumatically drilled vertical shafts deep into the ground, about 60 meters down. Having been given exact details on where to dig by his contacts, they unearthed an already existing network of tunnels. Who originally built them is unknown, but the fact they exist 60 meters underground makes this a very real treasure hunt.
When I found out how dangerous the job here is, I was hiding for a while. Only a few good friends knew where I am. On the internet, many people were searching for me, but I did not want that everybody knows where I am, because that could have brought me into danger.
Klaus believes he's very close to reaching the Japanese treasure. But it's not easy down in the tunnels, and he acknowledges just how dangerous it is.
In the first year, we were down already in a big hole, 30 meters, and we were already very close to one big bunker, and the whole mountain came down, because what I did not know at that time, there was a huge amount of clay. And when that material gets dry, it will very easily collapse.
By 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army had invaded much of Southeast Asia and removed many treasures as they looted Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and what was then known as Burma. Similar to what the Nazis were simultaneously doing across Europe, they stole priceless valuables en masse. This practice continued in Southeast Asia for many years. As the Japanese advanced, they mercilessly ransacked country after country, stealing art, gold, and treasures on a massive scale. This covert operation across Southeast Asia was codenamed Golden Lily and was headed by Prince Chichibu, the Emperor of Japan's brother.
This massive plundering of Southeast Asia was intended to fund the Japanese war effort, and the direction, the coordination of this huge theft went right up to the imperial household.
Having scoured treasures from across Southeast Asia, the next step in Operation Golden Lily was to get the treasure back to Japan. Before they could do that, they first melted down the gold into easy-to-move gold bars to erase any identifying features and prevent the valuable metal from being traced back to its country of origin. The gold was then taken to the Philippines to be inventoried before being shipped home to Japan on their massive naval fleet.
This plunder was meant to fund the Japanese military machine, and they knew they would need to win with technology. And they were investing heavily in some of the most sophisticated military vessels and weapons ever in history.
Japan's Golden Lily project probably was entirely real. looting systematically is a huge purpose for embarking on war in the first place. I mean, nations go to war to gain geopolitical power and riches.
But in June 1942, just 6 months after both sides had entered the war with the Japanese attack on the US Navy base Pearl Harbor, the US and Japanese forces met again, this time at Midway Island in the Pacific Ocean. Over the course of 4 days, the US sank 5 Japanese ships, destroyed 270 aircraft, and killed 3,700 military personnel.
You've got to imagine what a huge reversal of fortune this is for the Japanese. In 1941-42, they were conquering the Pacific. They had almost taken Australia. You know, they were on their way with Hitler to achieve global domination. And yet, in just a couple of years, the United States was pushing them all the way back across the Pacific, straight back to Japan.
The Japanese had lost control of the seas, and the only way back to Japan for the survivors and their looted treasure was blockaded by the US. It was too risky for them to ship the gold home. They needed a new plan. Allegedly, they sank a number of their own ships at sea to keep the Allies from intercepting them, and decided to bury much of the treasure hoard, especially the gold, under the island of Luzon in the Philippines.
The Japanese were in a tight spot. They had all of this plunder, but if they wanted to send it, let's say, to mainland Japan, they had to risk sending a ship with the wealth of their military out into open waters riddled with American warships, submarines. And so if you look at the complex island chain and archipelago of the Philippines, there are lots of little hiding spots, lots of little places where they could safely tuck away some treasure without it being noticed. And that may have been a much safer option than putting that out in the open where it could get sunk.
In their final effort to protect the treasure, the imperial family turned to one of their most experienced generals, Tomoyuki Yamashita. The general was instructed to hide the gold, with the hope that it could be recovered at a later time once the Japanese were victorious. He identified over 100 underground sites across the islands, many of which were previously existing underground networks.
To hide all this treasure, it's entirely feasible that the Japanese may have used pre-existing tunnels dug by the previous Spanish colonial power or the Americans, and possibly dug their own tunnels. But all of this, of course, to remain out of sight of the Americans in the air and local resistance.
Yamashita ordered detailed maps to be made of each treasure vault, what was stored there and how to navigate the tunnels into it, which was then carefully encoded. Unless you knew the complex code, these maps were meaningless, and there were even further layers of security to defend the sites.
The Japanese protected their hidden treasure locations by creating a system of treasure maps coded very elaborately based on ancient Japanese symbols, which would be very difficult for anybody else to decipher. If they were able to do so, however, there was a second line of defense in the hiding places themselves in the form of booby traps, such as cyanide vials that would explode upon contact, bombs, other things rigged to kill anybody who tried to go and take what the Japanese thought was theirs.
With time running out, Yamashita ordered the engineers to seal the treasure vaults. He had one last trick up his sleeve to protect the gold. The story goes that while the soldiers are carrying out his orders, Yamashita sealed the vaults himself, with the engineers still inside. They would be its guardians for eternity. Less than 3 months later, World War II was over. General Yamashita was put on trial for war crimes and took the secrets of the gold to his grave.
Yamashita never even had the chance to consider revealing the locations of the treasure after he was captured because he was executed by the American government.
But Klaus Donner, an Austrian researcher dedicated to uncovering the spoils of Operation Golden Lily, believes that the Japanese treasure remains in the Philippines to this day, and he is on the hunt for it. Based on insider information from the locals, he and his team have targeted one village of particular importance. Across the site, they have dug 4 vertical shafts deep into the earth, some nearly 60 meters. We are not allowed to reveal the locations of his shafts, nor the information he has gleaned from the locals, but he is sure he's close. It's dark and treacherous. The threat of death is all too real.
The most dangerous moment is coming when we open one of the chambers. And then we have to be very careful, because I'm sure that in the rooms you will find explosives. If we find gold bars, we have to be very careful, because I got information that some of the gold bars have a poison on top of the gold bars. That means if you would touch them with your plain hands, you would die. So we prepared already long rubber gloves, and we prepared also protection clothes for the moment we go inside the room. And if we have explosives inside, I get a special bomb squad to check it.
Although Klaus is yet to find out if he's on the right track, there was one infamous finding by a local that has been documented. In 1970, Filipino locksmith and amateur treasure hunter Rogelio Rojas obtained a permit to excavate a particular site in Baguio, in the north of the country. Why he chose that site is unclear, but he was reported to have dug underground for many months before uncovering an existing network of tunnels. As he dug further, there are reports of him finding weapons, a wireless radio, and the skeletal remains of Japanese soldiers. After several weeks, he broke through a concrete floor to a lower level chamber, where it said he discovered a large quantity of wooden boxes, each one about the size of a beer crate. When he opened one of the crates, he found 24 gold bullion bars. Rojas also claimed to have discovered a golden Buddha, whose head tilted back to reveal several handfuls of uncut diamonds.
After all that digging in dusty tunnels, tunneling his way in the dark, Rogelio Rojas, that moment of wonder where he finds those 24 gold bars and the gold Buddha. You know, he's finally found the enigmatic treasure buried by the Japanese all those years ago.
Rojas made no effort to conceal what he claims was a major find. He posed with the golden Buddha for at least one newspaper photographer, and it's reported that he showed it to several potential buyers. During the following weeks, Rojas is said to have sold 7 of the 24 gold bars.
He did this during a time when Ferdinand Marcos was dictator of the Philippines, and Marcos had issued an edict stating that all treasure hunters needed to get permission from him in order to go searching. Well, Rojas had not done this. Ferdinand Marcos sent his henchmen to knock on this guy's door and hauled him off to prison.
On April the 5th, 1971, men in uniform came to Rojas's house. They showed a signed search warrant issued by the local judge, a member of the Marcos family, and they inspected his house. They attacked his brother with their rifles and terrorized his family.
They came to our house in Aurora Hill. They raided our place. They get our personal things, Philippine money, the golden Buddha, and the gold bars. They take everything. We're a happy family before. And after they destroy our family circle. My dad told us that everyone of our family, they will kill. We ran away, almost half day to walk to go to the mountain. I stay at the mountain almost 7 years. I'm 6 years old at the time. We don't have any parents because my dad, they put in jail almost 2 years.
He was held captive and told to sign an affidavit that the raid on his home was performed in a peaceful manner.
There is a paper they want to sign. My dad don't like to sign that paper. They tortured my dad. They put an electric shock inside the body and they hit my dad. My dad is have a big black eye.
Once the authorities got wind of his discovery, his whole life was turned upside down. His house was raided, he was taken into custody, he was imprisoned by the state, and, you know, he was left very much as a broken man as a result of finding this treasure.
Interestingly, the case of Roger Rojas is perhaps the one piece of this story which is documented in legitimate historical evidence. And then that is in the records of a trial that was held in the Hawaiian Supreme Court 20 years after Rojas found his treasure, when he brought suit against the Marcoses for violation of his human rights, for the torture that he was subjected to when he was imprisoned.
In February 1986, Ferdinand Marcos was deposed and fled with his wife Imelda to Hawaii under US protection. He allegedly carried suitcases full of gold bullion bars and massive amounts of bullion certificates. During President Marcos's trial in 1993, American mining experts testified that Ferdinand Marcos had showed them a solid gold Buddha statue with a removable head, as Rogelio Rojas had described. It also matched the photograph of the Buddha with Rojas in 1971. They also testified that they were asked to help with the remelting of gold bullion and removing any trace elements that might reveal the country of origin. Was this the treasure that Rojas had found? Rojas again tried to press charges of bodily harm and the theft of his gold, diamonds, and the Buddha. A series of legal actions followed in Hawaii, culminating in a staggering jury verdict in 1996, awarding Rojas $22 billion.
A Hawaiian court conclusively decided that Rojas had discovered gold treasure buried in a cave in the Philippines, and that the Marcoses had taken it from him wrongly.
But nothing has ever been paid to either Rojas or his family.
We're waiting for the justice since 1986 until now.
Rogelio Rojas died a broken man in 1993.
Told to my dad, even you're dead already, Dad, I will continue the case and I will continue the treasure hunting activities, Dad.
Following in Rojas' footsteps, Klaus Donner has now spent over 4 years on his hunt for the Japanese treasure. He and his team have excavated 4 large vertical shafts down to about 60 meters into the earth. He claims that he was given exact details on where to dig, and they uncovered a large tunnel network. Who built them and why is unknown, but the fact that the system exists 60 meters below ground makes this a very real treasure hunt. And today, he's being joined by Andrew Goff.
Hello, Andrew.
Hi, how you doing? Good to see you. Oh, man, it's been a while. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How was your trip?
Researcher and writer Andrew Goff is a self-confessed mystery enthusiast. He has spent years investigating the mystery of the Japanese gold, and he believes that much of the treasure is still hidden underneath the Philippines. He's a friend of Klaus Donner and has visited him at his excavation site before.
I've been passionate about the Philippines and the legend of the Japanese who looted 12 Asian countries. The question being, did they take that loot and bury it in the Philippines? Is that fact or is that fantasy? So over the course of a number of years, I had reached out to Klaus Donner. He had completely gone off grid. Nobody had heard from him other than the rumor that he was someplace so spectacular that he couldn't leave. There's different kinds of sites, right? There's sites that have just football pitch chamber full of gold bars, but there's also something called imperial treasure. What's that, and which one do you think that you're close to?
I'm sure that we are working on 2 imperial treasure sites because on the way we had a lot of booby traps. The most dangerous was always the cyanide. They were putting cyanide in glass and they put the glass inside the cement. I know what I'm doing because with 70 years, I would not be 4 years here digging in knowing that I'm spending my time for nothing. I hope for me that we find also many interesting, very old artifacts.
It's more than likely that there have been treasure hunters out there looking for all this loot. And if they've found it, why would they go public? Isn't it more likely they just keep it privately to themselves?
Hi, hello, my friend.
Good to see you again.
Within the secretive treasure hunting community, there have been finds which give Klaus hope.
I know some people who really found some treasures, some gold bars, a small jar with some diamonds, and I was shocked.
Klaus claims that he was given all sorts of important information by people who knew what was hidden and where the Japanese put their treasure. He began by scouring the site for signs left by the Japanese that could reveal the location of the hoard.
That's the horse head, sir.
This is here?
Yes, sir. And then the eagle.
That's amazing. It does look like a horse's head, doesn't it? There's the eye, there's sort of the nose.
And another one we have over there. That looks, for me, like a geographical map of the area here, that when they came back, they would have the map. They would know exactly which direction means what.
Makes a lot of sense.
Find the next markers.
The interesting thing about Klaus are his methods. They're a combination of many different disciplines. He uses maps. He researches areas that are more likely than not to have been places where the Japanese could have hidden things. He also interviews people, talks to the elders to understand, have you seen something? Can I find an eyewitness?
I met also another eyewitness when he was 16 years old. He was working for his father on the field, and then some Japanese soldiers came. They just took all the corn on the floor and they loaded heavy boxes on that small cart, and they forced the young guy to bring those pieces up to one of the places where we are now working. And he saw how they brought the heavy boxes up to the small hill. That's exactly the place where we were digging.
Klaus isn't short of determination and enthusiasm, and nobody can take that away from him. And he's dug his own tunnels. He's identified what he believes are markers in the countryside that indicate where those tunnels are. But are these markers real?
Look, here, for example, is another typical marker, because you can see that this and this is a different material, no? And here.
Right.
It looks like a big tunnel and side tunnels, and we know that here are tunnels with side tunnels. No?
In the village where Klaus is digging, the Japanese come repeatedly asking about a particular tree. I've seen that tree. Of course, everyone says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no such tree, not here. So there's a memory or some copies of these maps that have, trees that aren't indigenous, stones that are carved to look a certain way. And this gets into the realm of, are you seeing things or are these really markers? I think if we had the original maps that had the location of where these symbols are, then it would be a lot more believable.
I'm quite sure on our 4 places now we are very, very close, because first was the white ceramic, the next layer had some leaves in front, gold dust and diamond dust, and we have a big echo on each of the places in front and sometimes also on the side. That means the entrance and then the room going around the corner, the chamber.
Klaus is excavating vertically. He's digging tunnels straight down, and that's one of the most dangerous types of digging or excavating you can do. In this area, particularly with the volcanic activity, you get instabilities within the rocks, but you also get gases coming out from the volcanic activity, such as sulfur, and this can kill within minutes.
But despite the danger, Andrew is keen to see the tunnels for himself.
I'm really not a squeamish guy. I'm not claustrophobic. I've crawled through mastabas and pyramids all over the world, no problem. But these tunnels are different. You're taking your life into your own hand as you descend down. The ladder is completely vertical and made of bamboo. So the steps where you put your feet, you get about that much of your foot secured, and it's completely wet. I distinctly remember, what am I doing? I could die, I could fall. It takes all of your focus and all of your attention to just get down to the point where now you have to walk on your hands and knees. It couldn't be any more inhospitable.
How many people are working down here at any time?
3 in this tunnel, 3 in that tunnel, and the others bringing the material up from top.
That's a lot of people. That's a lot to coordinate.
Oh, yeah.
The really interesting thing is you finally reached the bottom. He hasn't gone any further. You're at the very end of where he has gotten to. And you would think, all I want to do is sit here, explore, contemplate. No, you want to get the hell out of there because you fear, not that it's going to collapse on you, but you can't imagine how it feels to be that deep in such a tiny space. You just want to leave.
This is not easy. This is not health and safety walk in the park. It's damn dangerous, but the reward is going to be huge.
But despite their belief that they're on the hunt for and very near to finding the so-called lost Japanese treasure, not everyone believes that it's there.
Tunneling is really advantageous to the Japanese as a form of defense. You can get a kind of small, wiry little Japanese guy down a tunnel, but you can't get a great big US Marine down it. And we see that in Vietnam 20, 30 years later. So actually, tunnels are essential for Japanese defense. They're essential for hoarding far more useful things, such as food, ammunition, and other sorts of supplies. Actually, booty and plunder and bars of gold are pretty far down the list. And actually, you're probably not going to store them in a place your enemy's going to try and attack. You're going to probably want to store them in the safest place possible, and that's back home.
Now, for me, as somebody who understands the logistics of military operations, this doesn't hold a lot of water. The reason is, imagine all the logistics the Japanese needed to get those goods up the mountain. You would have needed a similar, if not greater, logistical trail or chain to do the same thing, getting it down the mountain and out into the system. Now, soldiers talk, and the rumor mill among soldiers runs rampant. And the fact that there have not been any real credible reports from soldiers or Filipinos who said, I actually carried some of this plunder, this treasure, down from the cave or from the mountain, tells me that it seems unlikely they would have been able to pull off an operation like that with such secrecy that there's absolutely no evidence of it.
And even in the Philippines, there are some skeptics. Dr. Ricardo Jose is an expert on the country's history.
I don't see the logic of burying treasure in the Philippines, particularly in 1944, because first, the guerrillas were all over the place. The guerrillas were watching. They had eyes and ears everywhere. They would have known what was going on. They would have reported this. And then, secondly, the Japanese could have used other areas to ship the gold or the other treasures through. They could have used Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, which were theirs anyway.
But modern-day treasure hunters aren't deterred by this harsh reality. They firmly believe that there are still priceless valuables to be found.
If you're a treasure hunter today, do you think, hey, I'm gonna go by the book and get a permit and find the treasure? No, you don't, because you know you're putting up a signal to the government that you've got a treasure site. So nobody asks for a permit, and plus they don't want to give away 30% of what they find to the government. And that's why you don't hear about discoveries, because it's all on the lowdown. There's places in Manila that will melt down gold and put it into a modern standard. That's what's going on.
The thing about the Philippines is it's long been treasure central. You know, way before Yamashita, you had rumors of American bullion being located in the region, but even more attractive, the Spanish ruled the Philippines for 400 years. Think of all those galleons loaded with silver and gold coming from the New World that were shipwrecked, and some of these shipwrecks undoubtedly exist. So the Philippines has always been a magnet for those looking for treasure.
At their undisclosed excavation site in the Philippines, Klaus and Andrew go back underground into the second tunnel. While Klaus has dug 4 tunnels at this site, due to excessive rainfall, only 2 of them remain stable enough to enter.
3 to 4 weeks ago, we had 3 weeks continuing heavy rain, 1 typhoon, 1 monsoon hit us, and we had a big problem in the tunnels because it was too much water. We have here water. The ladder is very slippery. Here we have a round boulder, a marker that we saw that we are on the right way down inside the air shaft. And I can see already that there is still a lot of water in the tunnel. You did it, Andrew.
Thank you, guys.
I'm proud of you.
That wasn't so bad. Very exciting.
So shall we go? Andrew, this on that side, that is our deep hole. That's the sub-tunnel. And now we are on 42 meters, and we go here, the other tunnel.
The thing about Klaus's work is that you would think after 3 years he would have found it. But the fact is, the reality is, these chambers are incredibly deep, and that's why nobody has found them. They're from historical record of people around the time when the first chambers were excavated, indicate that they're about 220 to 230 feet deep. Now, Klaus is just about there. He's probably within 10 or 15 feet of that level. It's absolutely humbling to be down here and to realize the effort that goes into these inhospitable conditions. I mean, I know there's usually not water in here, but Klaus, this is extreme.
It was a horrible hard time sometimes, because sometimes you cannot sleep in the night, you wake up sweating, you think, are you on the right way? Is all the time and the money you had to spend for nothing, do you really find something? But thanks to that gift, without that, we would never have been able to find those perfect markers, the ceramic wall and all this, which gives me the knowledge that now we are really close. But on the other hand, the closer you get, the more unexpected trouble are showing up. It looks like somebody would test you. Is he really able to get it? Is he the right one to get it? So let him get a lot of water, let him blow off the generator, burn out the pump, and then you have to count, can I buy a new pump? It's getting already tight. With more budget, we would be long already finished.
So what are you going to progress next?
We break the cement with the leaves, and the echo shows me that we are close, and then we should be in the first room.
Amazing. So you're talking maybe a week or 2 weeks of work?
1, 2, 3 weeks.
Right.
I don't know how thick is the wall.
Amazing work. Amazing work.
On the way down, we always found special markers that gave us the security that we are really on the right way. For example, we found triangle stones. We found round stone with a hole inside, which means also correct destination. We found incense, big parts of incense in the hard material. Here we had also a white layer showing us that that's another way to a tunnel. So we are here on a crossing point of 1, 2, 3 treasure sites. When you find white cement, that means you are very, very close, and we got already on all 4 of our sites white layers. So that's made me sure that we are now really close. And also we found close to the white, we got some layers with gold dust, we got some layers with diamond dust. So that means we are definitely on the right way.
I'm astonished at the commitment that an effort like this requires. I mean, just look at this. You couldn't possibly have more arduous conditions. But everything that he says is true. This is all man-made, it's artificial. And by all accounts, he's really close.
We assume that the Japanese took some of that treasure out on hospital ships and that the Marcuses got their fingers all over it as well. We have to ask ourselves how much of it is left.
Despite numerous theories about where the valuables might have gone over the decades, Klaus Donner is one of the many treasure hunters who believe it's still buried deep underground.
We are on the bunker wall. Very, very hard to go through, because as I heard, the bunker walls are between 3 and 5 meters thick of this very, very hard cement. We had a big problem in the tunnels because were filled with water, so we had to buy additional pumps to pump out the water. All the tunnels are in a good shape, no danger for the people, so we can finally continue, and I'm quite sure we are very, very close to a success.
Klaus has expended huge effort in the Philippines and really tapped into that belief that there is treasure underneath the ground in that country, and he's found markers which he claims that the Japanese put there locating the tunnels. He's dug his own tunnels, he's used dowsing to try and find this treasure. But, you know, after years of effort and years of determination, and nobody can take that away from Klaus, unfortunately, he's found nothing.
After years of supporting a long and deep dig, he is very low on funds.
It's really difficult to get your head around how expensive this operation is. Klaus is a 70-year-old Austrian. He's retired. He's now having to employ over a dozen people. I've stayed with Klaus in his home. Every night, the workers come over, and Klaus's partner feeds them every single night. And when I ask the core members of his team, do you think you're about to discover a Japanese treasure hoard? They say, yes, of course. And I say, What are you going to do when you get your share of all those millions? I'm going to open up a rice farm. It's as though the quest is what keeps them going, not so much the money at the other end.
Patrick Nicholas has worked with Klaus's team for the last 4 years. He's a former aircraft technician and helps locate the tunnels.
I mean, there are many times that I've seen him go through his challenges, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I would have quit a long time ago. However, the focus and the devotion that he has to what he's doing is something that I'd like to really get close to. The fact that we're on the cusp of success, I'm very excited, and I also understand that, the closer we get to success, the more obstacles that we'll have, the more challenges we'll have, but we just have to stay focused, Thank you.
See you next week.
Okay, have a good one.
Have to do a lot.
Okay.
Bye, have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Klaus is absolutely resolute, not one iota of doubt that he's going to find the treasure. His motto is, we dig it. No worry, it will happen.
With all of these treasure hunters and all the labor hours that have gone into digging, tunneling, excavating, what has been found so far? At the very best, maybe we know the geology a little bit better, but in terms of treasure, not a single thing.
Klaus Donna is utterly convinced he's going to find this treasure. Does that mean he will? The harder you try, the more likely you are to succeed at anything, so I say go Klaus.
Sometimes these things are all-consuming. Actually looking for treasure becomes a hobby rather than an end in itself. So, good luck to the man. I'll buy him a drink if he finds £20 million worth of gold, over the next 4 years. But in the meantime, he should just enjoy the jungle.
Preserved in Italy's Turin Cathedral is one of Christianity's most famous holy relics, the Turin Shroud. It's said to be the burial cloth in which Jesus was wrapped after his crucifixion over 2,000 years ago.
The shroud completely inspires those who believe in it because we have to remember, Jesus left no physical trace of himself on earth. He wrote nothing. There's no archaeological evidence, actually, that he existed. But if the shroud is real, then this is tangible proof that he did.
The Turin Shroud might be the silver bullet that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt the existence of Jesus Christ.
Incredibly, it seems Jesus' image was somehow imprinted on the Turin Shroud when he was buried. Although the image is very faint, a negative is much clearer. Could this really be the face of Jesus after his death, crowned with thorns? Millions of Christians faithfully believe so, as do some scientists.
I think we can be certain that this is the burial wrapping of Jesus.
Skeptics disagree.
Unfortunately, it's a pretty obvious fake from the Middle Ages.
What is the truth? Is the Turin Shroud genuine? Or can other amazing explanations solve the puzzle of its mysterious properties?
It's not the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It's the world's first photograph, created by the world's greatest genius, Leonardo da Vinci.
Turin Cathedral is home to one of the most famous Christian relics on the planet, the Turin Shroud.
The Turin Shroud is so iconic because it represents what might be the only physical, tangible proof of Jesus Christ.
The shroud gives a face to a man whose legacy has dominated so much of human history. His physical anatomy is visible on this shroud, and that's incredibly powerful for many people.
But is the Turin shroud really the genuine burial cloth of Jesus? Today, the Turin shroud is displayed to the public only on rare occasions. But a modern copy is on permanent display in the Church of the Holy Shroud near Turin Cathedral. Bruno Barberis is the scientific coordinator of Turin's International Centre for the Study of the Shroud.
We can see, the most important thing, the double human image. Here we can see the face, the chest, the hands, and the legs. The blood image are clearly distinguishable due to the fact that they are more red. In my opinion, the probability that is not a fake, but is really the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth is very, very high.
Skeptics, however, are convinced that the Turin shroud is not Jesus' genuine burial cloth. Partly because the first solid historical evidence of the shroud's existence isn't until it appeared in France in the 1350s, nearly 1400 years after Jesus' death.
The shroud shows up under very suspicious circumstances in the hands of a soldier of fortune named Geoffroy de Charnay. And he never was able to say quite precisely how he, a man of modest means, had acquired the most holy relic in Christianity.
Adding to doubts about the shroud's authenticity, a French cleric of the time denounced it as a forgery.
When the shroud was first exhibited in the 1350s, the local bishop complained and said that this was a bad thing, this was misleading people, and he said he even met the painter who'd painted it.
Despite this, the legend of the shroud as the true burial cloth of Jesus continued to grow over the centuries. A fire damaged it in 1532, causing burn marks and water stains. But the nuns quickly patched it up. And in 1578, it was moved from France to Turin, where it's been treasured ever since. Yet given the shroud's cryptic origins, today the Vatican is officially cautious about whether the shroud is genuine or not.
The Church, or the Catholic Church's position with the Turin shroud, is actually very ambiguous. They don't say it's a forgery or a fake or a painting, and neither do they say, it's the real thing. They have some ambiguous statement that's very carefully crafted to say that people must believe what they must believe. And that's, a really kind of cheeky, in my opinion, way of giving their room for doubt for those people, who are religious and do choose to believe it, and they can take from that statement from the Vatican that, in fact, well, they're not saying it's not true.
The Church doesn't actually say itself that this is a literal image of Christ. They refer to it not as a relic, but as an icon, that it's a representation of Jesus. So if you want, the Church itself seems to be keeping its options open.
True believers and skeptics alike want to resolve the debate about the shroud once and for all. For over 40 years, both sides have turned to science to provide the definitive answer. The first large-scale scientific investigation of the shroud was carried out in the late 1970s by the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Barry Schwartz was a photographic expert on the primarily American team.
We did a myriad of different types of photography, but we also did spectral analyses, X-ray and X-ray fluorescence, and reflectance analysis. So we had all of these different pieces of equipment at that moment in time that were state-of-the-art, and ironically, the single question we went to answer, how is the image formed, we were unable to answer. We knew of no mechanism that could make an image with the chemistry and physics that we found on the shroud. And because of that, I came to accept that this was most likely the burial shroud of the historic Jesus.
Barry Schwartz was involved in a scientific analysis of the Turin Shroud in 1978. He conducted an optical analysis of the shroud, and he and the project, which became known as STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project, were resolute defenders, I think it's fair to say, of the shroud, of its veracity. And ever since 1978, Barry has been really an advocate for the truthfulness of that icon.
Since Schwartz's team examined the Turin Shroud in the late 1970s, many others have done scientific studies of their own. Some have agreed that it's likely to be authentic, but many others have declared the shroud to be a medieval fake.
So now we have all these scientific proofs that the shroud is real, along with the scientific proofs that it isn't. The debate rages, but this is one of the most central artifacts in Christianity, if it's real.
One of the most recent scientific studies, published in 2018 by forensic anthropologist Dr. Matteo Barini, employed bloodstain pattern analysis, a technique often used in criminal investigations.
Morning, people. So ready to start with the experiment? Yeah, very good.
In the first part of his recreated experiment, Dr. Barini is comparing the blood pattern on the Turin Shroud to how Jesus would have bled if he was crucified on a traditionally shaped cross.
So now your arm is extended like the classical crucifixion position, so with the arm completely horizontal. So now, exactly, we see here the bleeding with the arm completely extended. So what we see is that there is just a bleeding that is going down, following the law of gravity, going down 90 degrees. However, what we see in the Turin Shroud is not this.
Instead, the blood from Jesus' wrists, as seen on the Turin Shroud, didn't drip at a 90-degree angle to his arms, but dripped along the length of his arms. But this doesn't necessarily mean the Turin Shroud is a fake.
We have a very particular image of Christ on the cross, and that's because of centuries of medieval and Renaissance art that have fixed this vision in our mind. But actually, Roman crucifixions equally took place on X-shaped crosses, T-shaped crosses, or simply even nailing the victim to a tree that was still living. So Christ's crucifixion actually could have taken any one of these forms.
As a result of this, Dr. Barini repeats the experiment as if Jesus was crucified with his hands nailed high above his head.
Yes, here you see, I will hold your arm so you will not feel the pain of a proper crucified person. As you can see here, the blood is coming down quite vertically. Now, this is the direction that we have in the Turin Shroud.
Scientific testing could support the authenticity of the Turin Shroud if Jesus' hands were nailed high above his head. But what about the evidence suggesting the shroud is a medieval forgery? And if it is a fake, who would have had the motive and skill to create something so convincing that it's fooled millions of people for centuries? There is another test that the shroud must pass in order for it to be considered real. And so, for over 40 years, scientists have sought to identify the date in which the shroud was created, in the hope of revealing whether it really dates back to the time of Jesus' crucifixion, or if it is a later forgery that has continued to fool people for centuries.
The single best scientific data point we have on the shroud is carbon dating that was done in 1988. It was done immensely scientifically and independently and overseen by the British Museum. Strips of the cloth were sent to Oxford, to Arizona, and to Zurich, and they all tested independently of each other. And the results that came back with a 95% certainty were that the linen dated from between 1260 and 1390.
So if the carbon dating was accurate, the Turin Shroud is a medieval fake, dating to the 13th or 14th centuries. But if this is true, who could have created it? And what were their motives? Again, there are many theories.
Most medieval people were illiterate. The way they got their knowledge about Christianity and the saints was through images. These were paintings in churches, these were flags, these were stained glass windows. The Turin Shroud falls into this category. This is a pictorial demonstration of a key moment of Christ's life, and it's educational and instructional.
I think you simply have to look at the Turin Shroud as a work of art. You know, it's clearly going to have been painted in some way, using some sort of pigment or ochre, and it was clearly there as a kind of relic for the credulous and the gullible and people who are trying to make believe.
But if it is a fake, it is clearly a very convincing one. And one shroud researcher in particular, Lynn Picknett, claims to have identified the person who faked it so convincingly. Very few people would have had the motive and talent, besides one of the greatest artists, scientists, and inventors of all time, Leonardo da Vinci.
We can't be certain who commissioned Leonardo to fake the shroud, but almost certainly it was someone in the Vatican, perhaps even the Pope, because in those days they were very corrupt. And basically they wanted the ultimate Christian relic that would pull in the punters and line their pockets.
From the late medieval ages, there was a significant commercial value in having holy relics because you would draw pilgrims not only to your church, but to your city, and that was a significant source of income.
We know Leonardo was given a room in the Vatican, a secret room. We don't know much about what happened in there, but whatever it was, it involved a machine made of mirrors, and it is said that whatever went on in that room, the German mirror makers that were employed ran out screaming that it was sorcery, and it seemed to involve huge flashes of light.
Lynn believes that Leonardo da Vinci had the equipment and skills even in the 15th century to experiment with photography. She claims the Turin Shroud is actually the world's first photograph.
I personally have no doubt that Leonardo had the technological know-how and means to fake the Turin Shroud. Leonardo invented so many innovative things that have only come to mass production. Helicopters, flying machines, all sorts of technological devices that were hundreds of years ahead of their time. And he was working with camera technology.
He built a camera obscura, which he called artificial eye, with a little hole in one wall, and you projected images through it onto the inner wall. What you had to do is you put a cloth in the camera obscura coated with light-sensitive chemicals. Chemicals that were readily available in Leonardo's day, for example, egg white and urine, and basically the light hits it and the image forms.
But developing a photograph using a camera obscura can take several days. So it's very unlikely Leonardo da Vinci got someone to stand still for so long in front of the pinhole. Instead, Lynn believes that Leonardo used the body of a corpse and the cast of a Jesus-like face to create his photographic image of Jesus on the shroud.
The idea that Leonardo da Vinci could have effectively created a Renaissance-era photograph of Jesus isn't quite as outlandish as it may seem, because for one thing, the idea of the camera obscura was known 500 years before Leonardo, and we know from his drawing of the Vitruvian Man that he was fascinated by the way that human bodies move and so on. So it might have been that the Turin Shroud was one of Leonardo's more bizarre experiments.
Leonardo had no compunction about doing terrible things to corpses in his anatomical researches. He would have experimented until he got it right. He would have crucified a corpse.
Then Lynn believes Leonardo da Vinci illuminated his cast of a Jesus-like face and the crucified corpse, projecting their images through a crystal lens onto the light-sensitive cloth in the camera obscura.
After a couple of days, you take the cloth out and you wash it in cold water. And you're left with the light bits. The dark bits just wash away. So you've got a negative image, essentially. And there you have it, the shroud of Jesus. And then you paint blood on. And you've got it. And the pilgrims come in and they go, wow.
It's an extraordinary idea. Can it really be substantiated that Leonardo da Vinci crucified a corpse in order to create Christianity's best-known holy relic? Lynn Picknett is committed to trying to prove this theory beyond doubt. Yet there is still the possibility that the Turin shroud is genuine, and to this day, scientists continue carrying out experiments to try to verify its authenticity. Although the radiocarbon tests carried out on the shroud in the 1980s dated the shroud to be the 13th or 14th centuries, some refuse to accept their conclusion that the shroud is therefore some kind of later medieval forgery. Many have identified what they believe to be inaccuracies in the scientific process used, coming up with a myriad of explanations for why the tests could have come back with dates that do not fit with the crucifixion of Christ.
So one prominent line of argument is that soot from the fire that the shroud suffered impregnated the fibers, and that has thrown off the carbon dating. Well, it's a theory that you can put forward, but the scientists who conducted the carbon dating have addressed these issues and say absolutely not. Their tests take account of these factors.
So even though carbon dating has put the shroud firmly in the late 13th century, 14th century, those who believe that it's genuine have hit back by saying that the shroud has been in 2 or 3 fires, I mean one in the medieval era, and that it may have become contaminated by soot, by other debris, and that's what accounts for the carbon dating.
I have friends that are pro-shroud. I felt when the carbon dating was done, I felt genuinely sorry for them because I knew they were briefly, only briefly, they were devastated. And then they came up with several hopeful theories and they were back off and running again.
One long-standing Turin shroud researcher who doubts the reliability of the carbon dating results is Stephen Mattingly, recently retired after more than 30 years of working as a professor of microbiology at the University of Texas.
When the radiocarbon date came out, that kind of convinced me at the time that it was medieval and it was some kind of fake. But since I've thought about it and got involved in the research and thought about it scientifically, I realize now that it is the actual shroud of Jesus.
According to Mattingly, the shroud was dated inaccurately to medieval times, and not only due to fire. He believes the shroud could have also become contaminated by bacteria.
The radiocarbon labs didn't take into account the microbial and fungal contamination because of the fact that the components of bacteria and fungi and cellulose are identical. We really cannot use that as an indication of, you know, the date of the shroud.
He believes that one source of this bacteria could have been the air around the shroud.
Common contaminants, Bacillus subtilis, are in the air everywhere. Each day they're adding new carbon, radioactive carbon. So the contamination issue is something we can't deal with as far as the shroud of Turin is concerned.
Most significantly, Mattingly believes that not only did airborne bacteria affect the carbon dating of the shroud, skin bacteria also created the mysterious image of Jesus. Mattingly says that to create a really strong image on cloth, you need huge numbers of bacteria. And he says that's exactly what happened as a result of Jesus' crucifixion. his bloody death provided the perfect conditions for bacteria to multiply on the skin.
We know that they added a crown of thorns early on, and anybody that's ever had a wound in the head knows that it bleeds forever. There are reports of over 100 scourge marks on the body, front and back, that would also bleed. So we have an individual that essentially is bleeding continuously. And there are consequences to that. Most importantly, the fact that Jesus' own skin bacteria began to grow. They had all the nutrients they needed, and they would double every 30 minutes. So when the shroud was removed, it left the excess bacteria from his skin on the shroud. And that's what created this wonderful image.
To demonstrate scientifically that Jesus' skin bacteria could have created the image on the Turin shroud, Mattingly is going to coat his hand with some skin bacteria grown in his home laboratory and then imprint his hand on some cloth.
And I begin coating my fingers. This is Staphylococcus epidermidis, which I obtained from my own hand and brew it up. And we just keep repeating this.
But skeptics find it difficult to believe bacteria on Jesus' body could have created the image on the Turin shroud. And they point to the Bible for supporting evidence.
The synoptic Gospels, those that see things the same way, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they do speak about Jesus' body being wrapped in a shroud. But John, which many think is the most accurate Gospel, actually doesn't. It talks about linen strips and even a separate headpiece. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Gospels is what they don't say. If there had been an image on the shroud, you would expect them to have recorded that.
According to Mattingly, however, Jesus' image on the shroud may have simply needed time to develop after the shroud was removed from his body. As his experiment shows, an image created by bacteria does take a long time to develop.
You really can't see much right now. This will continue to develop over time.
The hoped-for image on the cloth is just barely visible for now. But the experiment was brief, and Mattingly says that Jesus' body was covered with billions more bacteria than his own hand. And Jesus' image also had much longer to form on his burial shroud. To demonstrate the principle, Mattingly shows an image of his hand on his computer that he created with bacteria years ago.
This was done about 20 years ago, and the color has developed over time. This is the negative, and it shows even more detail.
Although his theory is very controversial, as a result of his experiments, Mattingly is convinced that the image on the Turin shroud was created by bacteria multiplying on Jesus' skin during his bloody death. As a Christian, he finds Jesus' image on the shroud reassuring.
I have no trouble being a Christian and a scientist, but the truth has to be through science. I think we can be certain that this is the burial wrapping of Jesus. We talk about wanting to see his face in our prayers, and here it is. Here is his face. What does Jesus look like? We know what he looks like. We know how tall he was. We know many things about him because of the shroud.
Could Stephen Mattingly's remarkable theory be true? Did bacteria from Jesus' body really create the image on the Turin shroud? Some skeptics believe Jesus' physical representation on the shroud isn't realistic, suggesting that the shroud may be a medieval fake. To help solve the mystery, some look for clues in the history of Roman crucifixions. It can sometimes be overlooked that crucifixion was a punishment the Romans meted out to vast numbers of people. But the way in which Jesus' body was taken down from the cross and given a proper burial would seem unusual.
People who were crucified were normally crucified as seditionaries. They'd committed treason against the Roman state. And so normally they were left to just hang there, being pecked at by the birds and eaten by animals, and their body would have rotted on the cross. So the idea of somebody being taken down from the cross and being given a lovely burial with a shroud, highly unlikely.
Scientific evidence also provides important clues about whether the Turin shroud is genuine. Blood-stained pattern analysis has shown Jesus' wrist wounds are realistic if he was crucified with his hands high above his head. But what about other bloodstains on the shroud? In particular, the Bible mentions a wound caused by a Roman soldier who stabbed Jesus in the chest. Believers in the authenticity of the Turin shroud say the chest wound left this bloodstain. And also on the back of Jesus' body, this wide belt of blood. Is this realistic? To replicate the spear wound, forensic anthropologist Dr. Matteo Barini uses a simple method, a sponge on the end of a spatula.
This is the most to reality reproduction of what could happen. And here you see the direction of the blood following the gravity. But we have a problem. Here the blood is going down and is not going in any way behind.
Then how could the belt of blood on the back of Jesus' body on the Turin shroud have been caused by the spear wound? It's been said by some that the belt of blood could have been created if Jesus continued to bleed after he was taken down dead from the cross and was lying flat in his tomb. But is this possible?
I want to try to replicate this second bleeding. So this, for us, is representing the shroud, and this is the individual bleeding through the wound on the chest. It is expanding. And now we move the body, if you can, Alfie. Very good, great. Now, look at this. There is a big pool of blood here on the funerary cloth. And this is what we do not see in the Shroud of Turin. And this is absolutely non-realistic.
Overall, blood pattern analysis cannot recreate the wide belt of blood on the back of the Turin shroud, supposedly caused by the spear wound to the front of Jesus' body.
I think it's fair to say that Professor Barini's test pretty much proves that the shroud is a fake, at least on the criteria that he used, mainly because the front and the back simply don't match in terms of the wounds and the direction of blood.
In my personal opinion, I think that the Shroud of Turin was made in the medieval time where the majority of people were illiterated, so were not able to read the Bible and the Gospels, so was like a painting to educate people.
If the Turin shroud was created as a painting to enlighten medieval Christians, this could explain another surprising feature of the shroud. While the average height of a man in Palestine 2,000 years ago was about 1.65 meters, Jesus, as he appears on the shroud, is much taller, closer to 1.85 meters.
When you look at the shroud image, immediately you're struck by this very long, thin figure that's very unnatural in its elongation. And having studied Christian iconography, I recognized that this was just French Gothic art. It was the most obvious explanation, and that fit, you see, with its origin in France in the Gothic period.
There is no evidence that this is the actual burial shroud of Christ. In fact, it happens that most of the evidence points towards it being a medieval creation.
The Turin shroud is not genuine. It is a very impressive, highly accomplished, rather wonderful piece of medieval art.
It's conceivable that Jesus' elongated body on the Turin shroud just indicates he was unusually tall. But the suggestion that the shroud is a Gothic medieval painting designed to educate the faithful is a strong possibility. If the Turin shroud is actually a painting, in theory it should be possible to replicate it, recreating on cloth a very similar image of Jesus. But can a convincing, full-scale replica of the Turin Shroud be created today? Luigi Gala-Skelly, former professor of organic chemistry at the University of Pavia in Italy, has tried to do this. But before attempting to create a realistic replica of the shroud, Gala-Skelly first ruled out how it wasn't made.
If we think that it was a medieval artist to make the shroud, probably the first attempt he did was to see what the print of a real body leaves on a linen cloth. So we tried actually this. We covered a volunteer with a red paint, and we put a sheet flat on him. And this is the result. As you see, it looks very bad. It's distorted. Look at the face, completely awful. So this is not how the shroud was made. It's not the contact print of a real body.
Instead, Gala-Skelly tried to recreate the shroud using a technique known as bas-relief, rubbing the outside of a sheet to reveal the contours of the body wrapped within.
We have a volunteer under the sheet, and we have rubbed with a dry pigment the cloth. So we have followed the shape of the body. As you can see, it's not distorted. This is more shroud-like.
Unlike the rest of the body, a real face still appears distorted using the bas-relief technique. So the face of Jesus in this image was created using a contoured, flat plaster mold.
So this is a very simple technique available in the Middle Age. This is the only way you can have a face undistorted.
Gala-Skelly is using blue pigment to highlight the fact that the color doesn't matter. He says the faint image of Jesus on the shroud is a kind of ghost image of reddish acidic impurities left behind by the original colored pigment that has completely faded away over the centuries.
Now we will have to artificially age this image because the shroud had centuries to do so, but we want to do that in an hour, so we will put it into an oven at 160 degrees Celsius to simulate the aging.
After an hour in the oven, the image is washed to remove the pigment. Only the pigment's acidic impurities now remain on the cloth, which is then ironed dry.
Now the pigment is gone, and this is the image on the surface of the linen, nothing behind. And the final test would be to take the negative of this image and see if it looks like that of the shroud. So just a quick test with a cell phone, and yeah, this is the negative. It looks like the Shroud of Turin.
After adding his homemade facial replica to a similarly aged bas-relief of the volunteer's body, Gala-Skelly then painted on bloodstains in order to create a full-scale duplicate of the Turin Shroud.
Personally, I find Professor Gala-Skelly's bas-relief analysis extremely convincing. The image that resulted from this technique is one that closely resembles what we see on the shroud. So really a remarkable job.
Others aren't convinced by Gala-Skelly's recreation and say that it doesn't prove the Turin Shroud was painted. In particular, Shroud researcher Lynn Picnic remains convinced that the Turin Shroud is the world's first photograph created by Leonardo da Vinci, and she claims to have found further evidence to prove it.
The shroud has often been said to behave like a photograph. when seen in photographic negative, it almost leaps into life, into focus. It's quite astonishing.
Lynn's theory that the Turin Shroud is the world's first photograph is very contentious. But she has carried out experiments that indicate it is possible. By projecting an illuminated cast of a girl's head onto a cloth in a camera obscura, just like the one she believes was used by Leonardo da Vinci, she was able to create a recognizably shroud-like image of the girl's face. As for the face that Leonardo used when he created the Turin Shroud, Lynn believes, very controversially, that Leonardo used his own face to represent Jesus.
Leonardo would have thought, yeah, well, you're not going to get Jesus. Obviously, you're going to get my face. Leonardo was a heretic. He had very passionate beliefs, and they weren't Christian. In fact, there's every reason to believe that he hated Christianity, and therefore, faking the Turin Shroud was an act of rebellion. It just would have appealed to him.
Lynn's entire theory about Leonardo da Vinci, however, is considered very far-fetched by most observers.
The claim that Leonardo da Vinci made the Shroud of Turin, it's just not credible.
I love this theory that Leonardo da Vinci somehow created the Turin Shroud. He was an amazing visionary man, but even he couldn't have created something before he was born.
The problem is that Leonardo wasn't born until 1452, whereas the first generally accepted historical account of the Shroud places it in France 100 years earlier. However, Lynn claims that the Turin Shroud isn't the same shroud as the one displayed in the 1350s. She says it's significant that this earlier shroud was soon denounced by the local bishop as an artistic forgery.
Unfortunately, it was a blatant painting. So clearly what happened was the church liked the idea of having the shroud, the ultimate Christian relic, Jesus' own image and blood. But they didn't want that one.
According to Lynn, the original unconvincing shroud was secretly switched by the Catholic Church in the late 15th century, when it was taken from France to Italy. Leonardo's new, much more realistic shroud was then displayed in its place in order to attract as many pilgrims as possible. Despite critics who say that this is a fanciful and highly unlikely story, Lynn claims to have found further evidence that Leonardo really did create the Turin Shroud. She's found clues in the Salvator Mundi, the famous picture of Jesus said to have been painted by Leonardo.
If you split the Salvator Mundi down the middle, and you have that on one side, and on the other side, you have a picture of the Shroud of Turin, what you get is astonishing. Every single tiny feature lines up exactly. The Salvator Mundi, strange though it may seem, is actually also Leonardo. But there's more. Salvator Mundi is holding a globe, a crystal globe. And people have said, well, of course, the name means Saviour of the world, so that's it. He's got the world in his hand. But it's actually a crystal. And what did Leonardo use to create the image of the shroud? A camera obscura in which he put a lens made of crystal. This is his nearest thing to a confession he created the Turin Shroud.
Whatever the truth is about this amazing theory, the debate about the Turin Shroud will surely continue for years. Is it the world's first photograph? Is it a medieval painting? Or is it the genuine burial cloth of Jesus, imprinted perhaps by bacteria, with an image of his crucified body? Although carbon dating has provided compelling scientific evidence suggesting that the Turin Shroud is not genuine, believers continue to dispute the study's accuracy.
I just think this tells us that believers will always find fault with any amount of evidence that they're presented with.
I think that for some people, the idea that the shroud is the real thing that wrapped Jesus Christ's body is too beautiful to be impossible.
You could say that the Turin Shroud shows that we're a world divided between believers and non-believers, between those who want proof, scientific, rational proof if you want, and those who believe that faith is important. For them, believing that it is the image of Jesus is enough. That sense of wonder is enough for them.
In a way, the shroud brings out wonderfully that conflict that we all have between the rational and the romantic. It's wonderful to believe that the shroud might be real. It's a little tedious to have science tell one it isn't. But we all have within us that need for both. That spark of the imagination is always there. And for so long as humans have that, the shroud will have its supporters.
And so, regardless of the scientific evidence indicating whether it is or isn't the genuine burial cloth of Jesus, for millions of people, the Turin Shroud will undoubtedly long remain one of the world's most revered and iconic religious treasures. Over the past century, some of the world's greatest museums have collected a handful of mysterious crystal skulls. Said to be masterpieces of ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, some people believe the skulls have supernatural powers.
You can't help to be skeptical about the crystal skulls, but what if it's true? What if they are ancient and otherworldly?
Many amazing legends have formed around the crystal skulls, and today believers claim to be able to harness their ancient powers.
It works not only on your physical body, but it also works on your mental, your psychic, and your spiritual body.
I went into an altered state. I was being lifted through the dimensions.
But what is the truth? Are the crystal skulls just modern fakes? Or are they genuine ancient artifacts that possess extraordinary powers?
It's just not credible, and I would say not scientifically possible. They're modern, post-Columbus.
Whether we believe the legends of the crystal skulls or not, we're fascinated by the fact that it just might be true. These things could be ancient, they could be powerful, they could be evil. And what if they were? How amazing would that be?
Once a year in Mexico and Central America, families and friends gather to celebrate the Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead in Mesoamerica is a fantastic tradition, and if you've ever experienced it, you know it's a really immersive, spiritual ceremony spanning many days of, parading around towns and cemeteries with skulls.
But the Day of the Dead is more than an excuse to party. It's a commemoration.
The idea that you remember that you too must die. And although it's accrued over the years all the trappings of a festival, drinking and eating and so on, it's remembering their ancestors, remembering their family that's gone, and also pondering upon their own mortality.
For many people, the Mexican festivities around the Day of the Dead seem really kind of macabre. I mean, there are skulls absolutely everywhere, ornately decorated. But for Mexicans, the Day of the Dead is a time to celebrate those who've gone on before, if you want. And it's a way of almost helping those people get to the other side. And in fact, the more mournful you are, the more you're stopping your loved ones, your dead ancestors, from transcending from this life to the next.
But some claim that pre-Columbian Aztecs and Mayan rituals used a very different type of skull, made of crystal. For over 120 years, a handful of extraordinary crystal skulls have been collected and exhibited by some of the world's leading museums, like the Smithsonian Institution and the British Museum. Historically renowned as masterpieces of ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, the crystal skulls are said by some to possess supernatural powers.
Many people have come to believe that crystal skulls are in themselves objects of power. They're like spiritual batteries for good or evil. They are pre-programmed computers. You just have to basically touch them to tune into their extraordinary ancient lost knowledge.
Skeptics, however, dispute the crystal skull's seemingly magical properties and claim they are instead all too ordinary modern fakes.
Is the whole crystal skull legend a big hoax? The challenge in dating the skulls is that the crystal itself can be very, very old. But when was it carved?
There are two schools of thought on the crystal skulls. One is that they are incredibly ancient. Alternatively, there are more skeptical voices who say that the technology used is modern, and the evidence is there. They're barely 150 years old.
Probably the most mysterious and remarkable of all crystal skulls is the so-called Mitchell-Hedges skull. Exquisitely carved, this privately owned, apparently ancient masterpiece is said to have been discovered in the 1920s in the lost Mayan city of Lubanton, in what was then British Honduras, now Belize.
The Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull is perhaps the world's most famous crystal skull and continues to draw huge crowds wherever and whenever it's displayed.
It really is just a remarkably beautiful artifact.
The original discoverer of the skull in the 1920s was said to be the British adventurer and popular author F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, who later wrote about the skull and his explorations at Lubanton in his lurid and melodramatic 1950s autobiography, Danger, My Ally.
In his memoirs, Mitchell-Hedges stipulates that the skull is over 3,000 years old and is the embodiment of evil. In fact, he calls it the skull of doom.
Mitchell-Hedges also said in his memoirs that according to local legend in Lubanton, the skull of doom was used by the ancient Mayan high priests to perform dark and esoteric rituals.
Mitchell-Hedges was a kind of stereotype of the pipe smoker who just would take a puff on his pipe and then tell some whopping tall tale. I think everything he did was kind of self-promotion, trying to give himself a kind of exotic and exciting life.
Mitchell-Hedges is a really interesting character. He was absolutely a big personality, a very high profile adventure explorer, quite the Indiana Jones of his day.
Fittingly, one of the Indiana Jones movies was focused on the mystery of the crystal skulls.
The Indiana Jones movie about the crystal skulls certainly added to the oomph behind the whole crystal skull story.
As told by the Mitchell-Hedges family, the drama surrounding the discovery of the crystal skull in the 1920s rivaled any Indiana Jones plotline. Ironically, today, the current owner of the Skull of Doom lives in Indiana. Bill Homan regularly does public tours with the skull, spreading its fame. He is the widower of Mitchell Hedges' daughter, Anna, who died in 2007. Anna inherited the crystal skull after her father's death, and when Bill first met her in the 1980s, they bonded over their reverence for the skull and its legendary powers.
Yeah, we would sit at a picnic table in the backyard with the skull, and we'd sit there and talk, and it'd be just the skull and Anna and myself. And as we were talking, and somebody took a picture of it, if you look at the skull, to me, it looks like a little baby sitting there right between us. Can you see that?
Anna Mitchell Hedges explained to Bill that at the age of 17, she had accompanied her father during his explorations in Belize. And she told Bill that it was she, not her father, who had originally discovered the skull in Lubanton's tallest pyramid.
Anna, an adventurous little girl which she was, snuck to the top of this pyramid. And all of a sudden the sun moved behind this cloud and came straight down into the rocks. And inside the pyramid was a big light. And she ran down to tell her father. He got all the men up, and it took them like 6 weeks to make a small hole in the top of the pyramid. And Anna was chosen, being a small person. They tied a rope around her and lowered her into this pyramid, this completely dark, hadn't been open for 1,000 years. And she's going down, down into it. And she feels around and finds something. And when they bring her back up and the sun hits the skull, the Mayans started crying and kissing the ground. It's like their God had returned.
Since Anna's death, Bill has carefully treasured the crystal skull that her father initially called the Skull of Doom. It was due to its apparent powers of healing, however, that Bill and Anna renamed it the Skull of Love.
Anna's claims that she attributed to the skull are really quite incredible. For a start, she said it could cure cancer.
For the last 7 years of her life, she trained me on what to do with the skull, how to take care of the skull, and what she expected. She didn't want it to go to a museum, because in a museum it'd be in a 1-inch thick glass, and she felt that the skull needed to be around people. And it has an important job to do right now. It works not only on your physical body, but it also works on your mental, your psychic, and your spiritual body, because it works on your heart chakra. You have to see it to really understand it.
After the death of her father, Anna Mitchell Hedges becomes a bit of a cult figure because she takes the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull on tour around the world. Anna went on to marry Bill Homan, and after Anna's death, Bill has continued the tradition of the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull going on tour. People perform meditations with it, and it continues to be even more of a New Age icon than it ever was in Anna's time.
Today, when it isn't out on tour for healing sessions, the Skull of Love is kept securely padlocked in Bill Homan's house. Bill claims that quartz rock crystal, from which all crystal skulls are carved, has remarkable scientific properties. Quartz, he says, can store and transmit ancient wisdom and energy, helping to explain the crystal skull's healing powers.
As far as healing, I don't want to say, oh, you come here, you're going to get healed. That doesn't work that way. The skull has its own program, its own agenda. If there's 20 people in the room, the skull will affect each one in a different way. So it's not like one thing fits all, but it's very, very individual. Sometimes when people have a problem in the physical world, it's caused by something maybe psychically or maybe even spiritually. So where the healing goes is where it needs to go, and it's very, very unusual how it changes people, because it shows your inner self, who you are, and what your capabilities are. I tell people, once you see it, you'll never, ever forget it, and that seems to be the case.
The assertion that the skull of love has the power to heal is a remarkable claim. How could it be possible? Bill believes the scientific properties of quartz provide the explanation.
It's piezoelectric quartz. It's the same kind of quartz that they make computer chips out of. And so this is like a supercomputer. And if we had the knowledge to understand how it was programmed, I would think we would be able to use it for a lot of good things for mankind right now.
Bill believes the ancient wisdom programmed into the skull of love over 1,000 years ago has been stored within the skull ever since, as a result of the crystal's piezoelectrical properties.
There's no doubt that crystals appear to have qualities unique to them. They're special, but that doesn't mean that a crystal skull has magical powers.
Material scientist and artist Ashwini Baratula is an expert on the crystal's genuine piezoelectrical characteristics.
So what happens with piezoelectric materials is that if you take these crystals, like quartz, for example, and you make a slice out of this crystal and kind of press down upon it or squeeze on it, it generates positive and negative charges on the opposite sides of the crystal. So now you have something like a tiny battery or a power source. The cuts that you make in these crystals have to be extremely precise and done in a certain way. The higher the force you apply, the greater the voltage.
The reverse also applies. If an alternating current is applied to quartz, it will compress and expand alternately, in other words, oscillate. In fact, the energy produced by crystal oscillators today helps quartz watches and computers keep accurate time. Extrapolating from these scientific facts, believers in the healing powers of crystal skulls say that, like a computer, quartz can store ancient knowledge as data, coded into the form of energy. Believers also claim that quartz can absorb, store, release, and amplify both healing energy and malevolent powers.
Many people do believe that these crystals have healing properties and that different varieties of quartz will bring benefits to different parts of your body, if you will. Personally, I'm skeptical about these claims because of the basic disconnect that exists between the claims and the scientific basis for them.
But believers in the power of crystal skulls emphasize that even if crystals' therapeutic properties can't be scientifically explained, they've been accepted for thousands of years. In many ancient cultures, people wore crystal amulets to ward off illness and negative energy, and the practice remains popular today.
People believe that by owning a certain type of rock or crystal, that it would maybe cure a disease or would give them good fortune. And this has been revived in recent decades with kind of esoteric and new age beliefs, and it's now a vast industry. And if you're convinced that a small crystal can have a certain curative healing power, then imagine a skull, a quartz skull. I mean, just the power of that imagery allied to its physical properties goes a long way to explain why people ascribe a huge amount of significance to these objects.
Is there any real-life evidence of the crystal skull's claimed therapeutic effects? According to traditional Mayan wisdom, skulls do possess remarkable and transformative powers. Even today, they are said to possess supernatural powers, both malevolent and healing, partly as a result of the claimed scientific properties of quartz.
There are extraordinary special properties to crystals, and it's given rise to all sorts of ideas, semi-mystical ideas, that if you get up close and personal with one of these skulls, you can absorb some of its amazing vibrations for good or ill.
Although ancient crystal skulls are thought to possess the greatest powers, even their modern counterparts are believed to have a therapeutic effect. Today, popular spiritual healer Star Johnson Moser is leading a healing ceremony using crystal skulls on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula.
In the course of the ceremony, all of these crystals on the altar will be amplifying the healing energy, the Holy Spirit, the universal life force, whatever you want to call it. And if we can open ourselves enough, we can allow the entire energy of the universe to flow through us. But we have to get out of the way.
Star has chosen this location for the healing ceremony because 1,000 years ago, this region was a cultural stronghold of the ancient Maya, who are said to have originally harnessed the powers of crystal skulls.
So Israel is going to offer this water into the ocean and call forth the ancestors in the Mayan language. If anybody feels like taking a crystal skull and putting it in the water, can do it. Just don't let it go.
Although the therapeutic significance of crystal is disputed, local Mayan shaman Israel explains that crystal skulls help spiritually revitalize people because skulls, by their very nature, encourage people to focus on life.
It's important to understand our life is short. The crystals, the dead, represent our harmony, our balance. Because we know we're going to die, we appreciate more the life. When the people use stones, the life changes. More clean, more free, and the stones make that.
There's undoubtedly something about the image of the skull that's hugely powerful. I mean, we've all got a skull. It's sitting somewhere underneath my skin here. But the sight of a skull raises questions about death, whether or not there's an afterlife. There's something about looking into a skull that really moves and unnerves us.
Whether or not the crystal skulls actually have any real influence on the participants in the ceremony, it seems clear that people do feel better afterwards.
The ceremony was absolutely fabulous. It was really very moving, and I think little by little, if we spread this kind of energy, we will create a better planet. What kind of people do we want to be?
There is an immense appeal to believing that crystal skulls have a magical quality. If imbued with power by people's belief, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Perhaps the power of crystal skulls is just a placebo effect. The scientific principle which suggests that if you believe something can heal you, then it will. Although believers feel all crystal skulls, even modern ones, can have a healing effect, the supposedly ancient Mesoamerican crystal skulls are said to have much greater powers. But are these legendary crystal skulls truly ancient, or are they nothing more than modern fakes?
Nobody wants to be a spoilsport and say, you know, these skulls are not as old as it's claimed. But, of course, it's hugely important to the museums, to the British Museum, because they can't put skulls on display claiming they're thousands of years old when they're nothing of the sort.
In recent decades, scientific techniques have been developed to date the crystal skulls. But initially in the late 19th century, when the British Museum purchased their skull, the crystal skulls were authenticated mainly on the basis of their very convincing similarities to other Mesoamerican sculptures.
Anybody who's been to historic sites in Mexico or Central America will have seen plenty of skulls. I mean, they pop up over and over again in pre-Columbian art. So the idea of skulls being made by these peoples is not outlandish. Nevertheless, the problem with these crystal skulls, all of them, even the ones held by museums, is that there just isn't enough evidence of real archaeology having been behind their discovery. The only account that we have of the discovery of a crystal skull is the Mitchell-Hedges skull, and even that is called massively into question.
Until the end of her life, Anna Mitchell-Hedges stuck by her story of the skull's discovery. She claimed that during the 1920s, when her father was exploring the lost ancient Mayan city of Lubantan in what is now Belize, she found what he called the Skull of Doom. But Anna's story was never corroborated by anyone else who was at Lubantan at the time.
None of the archaeologists working at the Mayan temple site make any record of a discovery of a crystal skull. And of course you would, right? So there's all kinds of uncertainty, and rightfully so, that's been levied against where did this alleged Mayan crystal skull actually come from.
The British Museum crystal skull, meanwhile, was purchased in the late 19th century via an antiques dealer. But from which ancient archaeological site it was excavated, if any, is unclear. It would be possible to radiocarbon date a crystal skull by examining organic material in the layer of earth it was dug up from. But without this option, skeptics have had to rely on less certain, recently developed methods to test the age of the crystal skulls.
The British Museum and the Mitchell-Hedges skulls have been subjected to tests using new technology, and this has involved the application of dental putty onto the skulls and then an analysis of the incision marks.
You can actually approximate the date of the crystal skulls by examining the tool marks on the crystal. And when you do that, in each case, we find markings of a rotary device that would only have been in existence in the 19th century. So unless the Mayans had motorized rotary tools that we're not aware of, they have to be modern creations.
There's a scale called the Mohs hardness scale. It's a scale of how hard minerals are from 1 to 10. Silica dioxide, which is quartz crystal, is a 7. That's pretty high. You would need something pretty sharp, pretty hard, and pretty intricate to be able to make the detailed lines you're seeing on that skull. So I do not think that any pre-Columbian technologies existed to be able to manufacture a skull like that.
The scientific judgment that motorized tools were used to carve the crystal skulls, and they are therefore modern, is accepted by most observers. But not by the caretaker of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, Bill Homan.
They keep wanting to say that it was made with modern tools, but I did the same test using the same technique with this dental putty, and I took it off, and I worked with a scientist from one of the universities, and we did testing on it, and we found that it's perfectly clear and no marks at any kind. So the skull does not have any tool marks anywhere on the skull.
Even if it's proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that motorized tools were used to carve the crystal skull, Bill believes this still doesn't confirm that it's modern.
His response was very interesting. He said, that proves it's ancient because it was obviously given to the ancient peoples by advanced extraterrestrials whose own techniques were pretty much like ours today.
The crystal skulls are of such incredible perfection, and they've been crafted in such an exact way that some claim that extraterrestrials could have been involved in the making of these skulls.
Who made it, how it was made, I don't know. It's the most mysterious artifact. But I'm sure that there's some type of extraterrestrial group that communicates with the skull or through the skull. They say it has the knowledge of the universe programmed inside of it. The Mayas say that it's a communicator with the gods, is what they call it.
It's certainly a remarkable claim that aliens may have created the Skull of Love and the other ancient crystal skulls.
A solid piece of crystal was a really difficult thing to carve with the instruments and technology available at the time in the Mayans. So, of course, the belief is they must have had some help.
Legends have been forming around the mysterious crystal skulls for over a century. From stories of their discovery to Mayan esoteric rituals. But could the ancients really have received otherworldly guidance in order to create them? Those who believe that alien intelligence shaped the crystal skulls point to what they claim is corroborating evidence found in a remarkable document known as the Dresden Codex.
The Dresden Codex is a really important piece of the Mayan legend. It's the oldest surviving piece of pre-Columbian literature. And what's significant about it is that it refers to a really elite level of knowledge that the Mayans had in terms of astronomy, detailed descriptions about the transit of Venus and eclipse table predictions, really intricate stuff. People believe there's no way the Mayans could have known that. Thus, they must have been guided by extraterrestrials.
According to Bill Homan, Mayan legend suggests something more specific about the Mitchell-Hedges skull. The so-called Skull of Love may not only have connections with aliens, it may also have been created in the lost sunken kingdom of Atlantis.
The Maya believe that it was brought to their homeland by a people whose land had gone under the sea many, many years ago. There was a main area of Atlantis, and that, I believe, was probably around the Bahamas. And this skull probably has something to do with the Bermuda Triangle and the energy down there, the strange energy that they're finding. From what I understand, the skull was created for a Atlantean high priest that was loved very much. And they took his physical skull and they used that as a mold to build the crystal skull. So you see in the skull, there's all the bumps that a regular skull has. If you look in the eyes of the skull, it like takes you into a world, some other kind of world. So it's pretty amazing that way.
Believers in the crystal skull's supernatural powers can find themselves apparently being transported by the skulls into mysterious altered states. One such occurrence was experienced by spiritual healer Star Johnson Moser when she was invited for a personal session with the Skull of Love in order to learn from the ancient wisdom supposedly programmed into it.
When I was actually with the skull and was downloading frequencies from it, I went into an altered state, and I was lifted. I was being lifted through the dimensions. And I found myself in this incredible solar temple. And as I was speaking the language, flowers were coming out of my mouth. And people were there receiving the flowers and being blessed by the sacred language. So that was my experience with the Mitchell-Hedges skull. Every skull is different. And What I believe about the so-called ancient skulls, they have more experience because they're like holographic computers. They store information. They're like living libraries of the planet. There's some debate as to whether the Mitchell-Hedges skull is ancient or not, but definitely some higher level of consciousness went into that skull and transmitted that information, you know? They're receivers. So it doesn't really matter to me if they're ancient or what. I've learned through this work to have a different concept of time because time is an illusion. It's all happening simultaneously.
Skeptics believe that time and dates are important, however. Anna Mitchell-Hedges, for example, claimed that she'd found the relic her father called the Skull of Doom at the lost ancient Mayan city of Lubantan in the 1920s. But skeptical investigator Joe Nickel has discovered evidence which he believes indicates that this story cannot be true.
The Mitchell-Hedges skull has nothing to do with the Mayans. It's at the center of an incredible hoax.
What is the supposedly conclusive evidence suggesting that the Mitchell-Hedges skull is not what it's claimed to be? And if this and the other famous crystal skulls are really fakes created in the modern era, who made them? How? And why? "150 years ago, the great cultural achievements of the Mesoamerican civilizations, such as the Maya, were little known. But from the mid-19th century onwards, many spectacular lost cities began to be discovered. Soon a handful of mysterious crystal skulls appeared on the art market and were bought by some of the world's greatest museums.
At the end of the 19th century, there's massive interest in Europe in all things pre-Columbian, and the British Museum got onto the bandwagon and bought this skull, at that time believed to be thousands of years old.
With no scientific techniques at the time to accurately date it, nor proof of where it was found, the British Museum skull was originally authenticated mainly because it exhibited traits matching an ancient Mesoamerican obsession with skulls. Another famous crystal skull came to light in the 1950s, when adventurer Frederick Mitchell-Hedges wrote about the Skull of Doom in his autobiography. His daughter Anna said she'd found the skull in the 1920s, hidden in an ancient Mayan pyramid at Lubantan, in what's now Belize.
Sadly, it would appear as though the story of the crystal skull is not what we were led to believe. Documentation confirms that Frederick Mitchell-Hedges purchased the crystal skull in 1943 at a Sotheby's auction.
It was skeptical investigator Joe Nickel who did the detective work to find out the truth about the origins of the Skull of Doom, later renamed the Skull of Love.
It turned out that Mitchell-Hedges had bought this skull from an art dealer named Sidney Burney.
But when contacted by Nickel about his findings, Mitchell-Hedges' daughter Anna stood by her story of the crystal skull's discovery. She told him that she'd found the skull in the 1920s, inside the Mayan pyramid at Lubantan. Her father gave it to Burney as a security for a loan and then later bought it back at Sotheby's.
We asked her if she had any kind of documentary proof. No, it had all been destroyed in a hurricane.
Whatever the truth is, skeptics point to the scientific tests indicating that both the Mitchell-Hedges and British Museum skulls were carved using motorized tools, which ancient Mesoamerican civilizations didn't possess. There's also further scientific evidence published in 2008. Using Raman spectroscopy, the British Museum skull's chemical properties were tested. when the quartz from which the skull was carved originally crystallized millions of years ago, tiny amounts of minerals became trapped inside, providing a telltale fingerprint of the original geological source.
The chemical properties of the quartz from which the skull is made suggests that the raw material came from either Brazil or Madagascar, and frankly, neither of those two places were anywhere near the Mayan Empire, and it's unlikely that the Mayans had anywhere like that kind of reach.
So if the rock used to make the British Museum skull was mined in Brazil or Madagascar, where was the skull carved? A possible clue is that in the 19th century, a large amount of Brazilian quartz was shipped to the German town of Idar Oberstein, one of Europe's leading centres of crystal carving. Patrick Dreyer, whose family has been carving crystal in Idar Oberstein for centuries, believes it's likely that the British Museum skull was carved there, and that other supposedly ancient Mesoamerican crystal skulls were too.
So I read a lot about this Mitchell Hedges skull in the past because it was an interesting topic. And for me, it was always, how to say, funny stories. If it's really this mystical skull or is it a fake? I think the Mitchell Hedges skull is a very nice masterpiece, but it's easy to fix out that it was carved with a wheel. I think the chance that the Mitchell Hedges skull get produced in Idar Oberstein is very, very high. The quality was amazing. So you need definitely good craftsmen which can do this very high-end job. Here in Idar Oberstein, the people have the skill, the knowledge, and also the gemstone to produce the skulls. It could be possible that my great-grandfather was one of the guys who maybe worked with the skulls, maybe also with this Hedges skull. He lives in this time which the skulls get done, so this could be possible.
Pretty much all of those appear to have been made in Germany. There was a kind of a little industry there where they would get, I believe, Brazilian quartz crystal and cut it, and of course using machine cutting and so forth, and then you polish it, and turning out these really eye-catching curios. The Mitchell Hedges skull is in some ways the most interesting of those to me because it has the jaw detached.
If the crystal skulls were carved in Idar Oberstein in the 19th century, who paid for them to be made? The British Museum skull was originally bought from a colourful French antiquities dealer named Eugene Boban. And Patrick believes Boban may have commissioned many of the skulls to be made in Idar Oberstein.
I think this Paris dealer, he get an idea to produce these skulls to sell it together with this nice story about the Mayas. Our gemstone carvers learned in Paris around 1870, 1871, the technique of gemstone carving. So it was easy that this guy gives the orders here to produce the skulls in Idar Oberstein. Later, for sure, he sells the skulls as original found in Mexico to earn money.
Eugene Boban sold some crystal skulls. He sold them for profit and ends up having helped create an enduring mystery.
The British Museum now accepts that their crystal skull isn't genuinely ancient and may well have been carved for Eugene Boban in Idar Oberstein in the 19th century. But believers in the crystal skull's extraordinary otherworldly powers remain unconvinced by skeptics' doubts.
You know, everybody has their own truth. And I don't believe that the truth is absolute. I believe that we each have our own truth.
The fact is that it works on people's hearts and opens them up and gives them a feeling of hope. I think it's really a good thing, and that's why I work and bring it around so people can experience this.
Whether we believe the legends of the crystal skulls or not, we're fascinated by the fact that it just might be true. However, now we understand that the truth may not be as romantic or as adventurous as we were led to believe.
Even though scientific evidence suggests the crystal skulls are modern fakes, believers remain convinced that the skulls have ancient supernatural powers. It seems inevitable that people will continue to believe what they want to believe. Some people really do feel affected by their reputed powers. So whatever the truth is, the legendary crystal skulls will surely long be treasured.